Chapter 530. Her Highness Hathaway? Ian and others were stunned as they looked at Eugene. They didn't expect that Eugene's backer would be the sister of the Saintess. Ian was startled for a moment and turned to look at Dean. Dean was able to provoke Her Highness Hathaway and was still alive. It seemed that he wasn't a simple nobody. Dean's eyes lit up as he heard Eugene's words. He thought that Eugene was sent by Haisha's supporters to assassinate him, but it didn't seem like it. After all, there were many opportunities to assassinate him, especially when he was fighting with the Pecker. However, Eugene didn't act. Now it seemed that Hathaway sent Eugene because she wanted to know more about him. It also showed that she wanted to use him as a chess piece again. You still don't want to give up after getting the Saintess identity. Dean's eyes narrowed as killing intent rose in his heart. He glanced at Ian and others and saw their expressions. He slowly said, "Captain, this is our private matter. I hope you won't intervene. If he dies, then just report to the higher-ups that he was killed by the monster." Ian, Martin and others were startled as they saw Dean's murderous look. They knew that the battle couldn't be stopped. Ian knew the purpose of Dean's words. He was worried that they would help Eugene because of the existence of Her Highness Hathaway. But how could they do such a stupid thing? He didn't need to think about it to know that the person who offended Her Highness Hathaway must have a powerful force behind him. The ordinary dragon guards couldn't afford to provoke such a person. Ian hoped that both of them would perish together if necessary. It would be best if both of them died here so that they wouldn't have to explain it to anyone when they go back. But at the moment there was a monster sleeping above. If the two of them fought too much and alarmed the monster, then everyone would be in danger. Ian whispered after hesitating for a while, "Why don't you wait for the monster to leave? If we startle it, we'll all die." Eugene sneered, "No. There won't be any movement if we deal with it." After that, the muscles of his whole body slightly swelled, and the outline of golden scales faintly appeared under the cheekbones of his cheeks. This was the characteristic of releasing the full power of the magic mark. Ian was stunned when he saw the change in Eugene. His expression changed slightly. He was extremely sensitive to temperature. Although he didn't have thermal vision, he could still feel the obvious change in the temperature of Eugene's body. It had suddenly increased by several degrees. This had exceeded the temperature of a normal human body. If it was an ordinary person, such a high temperature would have already caused them to die. Dean had the most intuitive feeling. He clearly saw that the heat in Eugene's body was boiling rapidly. The fist was like a black cannonball as it hit Eugene's chest. Dragon armor instantly caved in. There was a faint sound of bones breaking. The heavy force made Eugene's body lose balance. He fell back and naturally lost his strength. Although his posture didn't change, Dean easily dodged the attack. Tap, tap. Eugene retreated 3 steps. He saw Dean was about to pounce. He hurriedly jumped back and pulled away more than 10 meters away from Dean. His face was a bit ugly. He even broke out in cold sweat. At the same time, he felt a bit angry. As a swordsman, he took the initiative to pull away from an archer. It was a shame. However, he didn't care about it at this moment. What really annoyed him was that he was once again fooled by Dean. Dean quietly stood in place and once again held the bow and arrow. He aimed at Eugene but didn't shoot. It seemed that he was looking for Eugene's flaws. Eugene didn't dare to act rashly. He was ready to cut the arrow at any time. Then he would step forward when Dean shot another arrow. He was careless before and was hit by Dean. In any case, Dean was an archer. His archery skills showed that he had studied archery for a long time. Naturally, his melee combat ability would be relatively weak. Both of them confronted each other. The atmosphere was dignified. Time seemed to stop flowing. 2 or 3 minutes passed in a blink of an eye. Eugene gently gasped. The pain from his chest made him angry. But he had calmed down. His body instinctively reacted faster when he was punched. Eugene panted softly. The pain in his chest made him angry, but he had already calmed down. The moment he was hit, his body's instinctive reaction was faster. He gathered his strength to protect his chest in time, or else he would have been more seriously injured. Eugene gently gasped. The pain in his chest made him angry, but he had calmed down. His body's instinctive reaction was faster when he was hit by Dean's punch. Otherwise his injuries would be more serious. At least he could judge that although there was a gap between him and the youth, the gap wasn't big. Fortunately, the surrounding environment helped him. In this narrow environment, Dean would have to fight him in close combat. Eugene was startled. He felt a trace of anger. He was cheated again. Dean didn't shoot the arrow. It was clear that he wanted to consume his energy and physical strength. He didn't want to shoot the arrow, but in such a confrontation, he needed to maintain his peak state at all times. Otherwise, the brute force of Dean's punch was enough to make him unable to dodge. Damn! Eugene cursed in his heart. He took the lead to attack. The longer the stalemate, the more he would suffer. Dean decisively shot the arrow as he saw Eugene pounce on him. Whoosh! As the arrow flew past, Eugene quickly brandished his sword and blocked it. Dean didn't think as he shot the arrow. He stared at Eugene and pulled out an arrow. Bang! Chapter 531. Eugene's pupils shrank and his face was full of shock. He hurriedly used his other hand to grab the saber in his broken hand. Dean mercilessly held his broken wrist and waved the sword. He used the broken wrist as the hilt. The sharp blade cut towards Dean's palm. Eugene was scared and retracted his hand. Dean took the opportunity to retreat and widen the distance. The fierce battle was over. Dean coldly stared at Eugene. He grabbed the hilt of the sword and pulled out the severed hand. He threw it on the ground. He didn't dare to continue to attack as he didn't want to let go of the sword. This life-or-death confrontation caused Ian and the others to break out in a cold sweat. They felt a shiver run down their spines. They knew that if they were to fight against either side, they would have most likely been defeated or even killed. Eugene's face was ugly. He held his broken hand to stop the bleeding. He didn't want to waste any more of his strength. The severe pain made him clench his teeth. But there was a trace of fear in his heart. He didn't care about the pain in his arm. He felt like he was falling into an ice cave. All of this happened in a short period of time. Dean's moves were beyond his expectations. He had lost his right hand and weapon. He didn't have the slightest confidence to defeat Dean with his ordinary basic armor. Failure meant death. He would lose everything including his loved ones and loved ones. Dean looked at Eugene's broken hand. His eyes turned cold. He didn't stay any longer and quickly waved his sword. Eugene stared at him. His left hand had loosened his right hand. Although his right hand didn't have a palm, both of his hands were still open in a defensive posture. Whoosh! 10 meters of distance was crossed in an instant. Dean's sword was aimed at Eugene's chest. Eugene decisively grabbed Dean's wrist. He wanted to take back the weapon. There were 7 or 8 techniques recorded in the Dragon Blade chapter. It was enough to deal with all kinds of situations. As long as he could take back the weapon, then he would have the hope to reverse the situation. Although his left hand wasn't as flexible as his right hand, but due to long-term training, he wouldn't neglect his left hand, so its flexibility wasn't any worse than Dean's. If Dean gave him a chance, he would have asked Ian and others to help him. Unfortunately, Dean's attack was too fast. Eugene couldn't be distracted as he wanted to end the battle in one go. Whoosh! Eugene's eyes flashed with joy as Dean's wrist was caught by Eugene. "It's over," Dean suddenly said. Eugene was startled as he was about to twist Dean's wrist. Before he could react, he suddenly saw Dean raise his other hand. Almost at the same time when he caught Dean's wrist, Dean raised his other hand and held the sword in his hand. Weapon fight? Puff! Blood bloomed out as the sword flashed. Eugene's body was numb as if he was electrocuted. He couldn't muster up any strength. Feeling horrified, he let go of Dean's wrist and touched his neck. The hot and viscous liquid covered his fingers. This clear touch caused his heart to violently twitch, followed by boundless fear. He opened his mouth slightly, and suddenly wanted to give up all his dignity to beg Dean to let him live and save him. But he saw that Dean had put away the sword and was quietly looking at him. There was no emotion in his eyes, as if he was looking at an ant. The darkness instantly pressed down, and with a bang Eugene's body fell down. Dean looked at him to confirm that he was dead. He slowly turned around. Although he had his back to Ian and others, but he could see the eyes of Ian and others. He knew what they were thinking. It's not good to stay here for a long time. We have to leave as soon as possible. I hope everyone can help us by saying that we were attacked by a monster, and he was killed by a monster. Ian and others were startled. They looked at each other and quickly communicated. Ian deeply looked at Dean. He slowly suppressed the killing intent in his heart and nodded. We will. Ian would have led Martin and others to take the opportunity to kill Dean if it wasn't for the fact that Dean wasn't injured and the battle didn't last long. After all, Eugene was one of Her Highness Hathaway's people. Dean killed him and they were witnesses. They weren't sure whether Dean would kill Eugene in order to hide this matter or not. However, now that Dean had said this and wanted to leave, it was obvious that he didn't want to fight. Martin didn't dare to act rashly. After all, Dean's strength was too strong. Even if the 5 of them attacked together, they would suffer heavy casualties, even if they could kill Dean. When are you going to leave? Martin asked. Dean looked at him and said calmly, I'll take a break first. I'll leave when my physical strength is restored. I'll wait and see. If our battle has alarmed the monsters above, I'll die if I go up now. Ian and Martin looked at each other and frowned. Their eyes were a little dignified. After hesitating for a while, they finally gave up the plan to attack. They weren't sure whether Dean was deliberately looking for an excuse to restore his physical strength or not. However, since Dean said it so openly and reasonably, they couldn't oppose it. They couldn't help but feel a little entangled in their hearts. Dean inserted the sword into the ground and took out the food and water from his backpack to eat and drink. There was a trace of excitement and fear in his heart when he recalled the previous battle. The reason why he dared to challenge Eugene, who had reached the peak of senior frontiersman, was mainly because of the intuition passed to him by his body. The intuition told him that the pioneer was dangerous and Eugene could fight with him. Just like the predators in the jungle wouldn't hunt prey that was stronger than themselves. Otherwise, it wouldn't be hunting, it would be called delivering food. I feel like I'm still missing something. Dean recalled the previous battle. Although there was a feeling of release, he always felt that there was something missing in his body, which made his body not flexible enough and even somewhat awkward. Perhaps if he grew more hands and feet, it would be more natural. Thinking of this, the image of Splitter appeared in his mind. Rich blade-like limbs and a horrible body that twisted like seaweed. His eyes flashed and he suddenly thought of a point. The magic mark could give the host similar abilities of monsters. From a biological point of view, it was hereditary. At the same time, the magic mark would be activated again to change the body. This was called evolution. So, since he could inherit some of the physical abilities of monsters, could he also inherit the fighting style of monsters? Dean thought of the feeling of fighting in his heart. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was so. Before, he always felt that he couldn't display it. But if he imagined that his body had more limbs like Splitter, it seemed that it would be very carefree. The thought of carefree was a signal from his body. Just like the brain knew when the stomach was hungry. In other words, the body had such a demand. The parasitic soul worm stayed in Splitter's body for too long. It completely integrated the fighting habits of Splitter and passed it to me. Dean frowned slightly. His body naturally couldn't grow more limbs like Splitter. This would make it difficult for him to stand in the normal human circle inside the giant wall. After all, even a saint like Aisha couldn't have a strange body that didn't look like a human. This would cause panic. He looked down at his hand and gently twisted it thoughtfully. But he found that the bones of his wrist were like a soft body. They were easily twisted to a strange angle. He couldn't help but be startled. He hadn't found that he could do this before. But this time he was forced to use his instinct in the crisis. Instead, his body showed this ability on its own. Although my body hasn't transformed into the shape of Splitter, but I am able to display a fighting state similar to Splitter. It means that my body is changing. Not only am I adapting to the transformation of the magic marks, but the magic marks are also gradually adapting to the transformation of the new host. The characteristics of Splitter and my body are gradually fusing with each other. Ian pondered. When Dean twisted his arm, Ian and others had been paying attention to him. They saw that his arm could be twisted to a horrible breaking position. Their faces slightly changed. Recalling his previous strange fighting posture, their eyes were full of fear. "Hey!" Suddenly there was a sound of surprise. Everyone was surprised. They looked at the source of the sound. They saw Rosemary standing in front of a broken white egg. Chapter 532. Ian was startled as he heard Ian's words. He got up and looked at Ian. Martin, Ruby and others also came over. The white egg, which had been cut open by the shock waves of the previous battle, was filled with amniotic fluid. Its color was turbid and extremely viscous, and it slowly flowed out from the broken part. It was about the size of a human infant, and its appearance was extremely strange. It looked like it was a mixture of the limbs of many wild beasts, and its overall shape was like a crawling lizard. It had a long, curled tail, but there were 7 or 8 small legs on its abdomen. There were 2 protruding bone spikes on its back, and there was a small hole in the middle of the bone spikes, which seemed to be used for breathing. Its head was triangular. It was a bit like a snake's head, but it was much bigger than a snake's head. It was covered with delicate scales. Its body was translucent. It seemed that it was still in the incubation state. Dean's eyes narrowed. The body shape of this little beast was very different from the silencer. Although the silencer he saw in the cave was in the mature stage and had changed a lot from the incubation stage, but there were some similarities between it and the silencer. Also, he had seen the wind silencers in the Atlas of Monsters before. The wind silencers were completely different from the little thing in front of him. There was a trace of surprise in Martin's eyes as he saw the appearance of the little monster. He suddenly thought of something and whispered, "It is not a silencer. We are likely to have strayed into another monster's nest." Another monster's nest? Ruby was surprised. Ian stared at the little monster in the white egg. There was an ominous premonition in his heart as he heard Martin's words. Suddenly, he saw the tail of the curled-up little monster move slightly. The movement was very light, as if it was an illusion. But he was very careful and knew that it wasn't an illusion. He immediately raised his hand and motioned everyone to step back. "It is still alive." Dean also noticed this. He took a few steps back to keep a distance from Ian and others. He wanted to avoid suspicion and also to guard against a sudden attack. "Alive?" Luna stared blankly for a moment as she suddenly thought of something. Her eyes lit up as she said, "This thing doesn't seem to be recorded in the Monster Atlas. It is likely to be a new variant monster. If we bring it back, we will certainly get a generous reward." Hearing her words, Ian and the others' hearts thumped, and a glimmer of light flashed in their eyes. Martin was calmer. He said in a low voice, "I think we need to figure out why there are eggs of other monsters at the bottom of the nest of the silencers, and there are so many of them. Obviously, they didn't ovulate in one go, and they don't look like the offspring of the corpse peckers and the blood sender, unless—" Ian immediately understood. And at the end of the mark, there was nothing on the rock wall. Everyone's expression changed slightly as they nervously looked around. Drip. Suddenly, an extremely soft sound rang out behind them. Dean, Martin and others turned around in horror. They didn't see the monster appear from behind, but saw a drop of red blood on the ground not far behind them. It seemed to be Luna's blood. Dean's pupils shrank as he looked up. The top of the pitch-black nest was filled with uneven rock walls, but there was no trace of the monster. Martin's face turned ugly as he looked at the teenager. "Can't you find it with your thermal vision?" "I can't find it," Dean replied in a dignified tone. At this time, Ian came over with Luna's body. He stared at Dean. "You seem to know something before the monster attacked." Martin, Ruby, and Rosemary looked at Dean with an unfriendly expression. Dean's face turned cold as he saw their reaction. "I saw an empty egg over there, so I thought that the thing inside might have hatched. I was about to remind you, but she was attacked. What do you want to suspect?" Ian stared at him for a moment and turned to look at Dean's previous position. He saw a tilted egg. He frowned and looked at Ruby. "Didn't you notice the egg when you and Eugene were looking for the exit?" Ruby replied, "I was looking over there. Eugene was looking over there. If I saw the egg then I would have told everyone." Ian frowned slightly. Of course, he believed Ruby. In that case, either Eugene was too lazy to look for the exit and didn't notice it. After all, Eugene didn't have night vision and needed the help of a torch, but the area illuminated by the torch was very limited in the dark. Or Eugene noticed it but didn't say it out loud and had other plans. However, now that Eugene was dead, there was no way to ask about the specifics, and there was no need to delve into it. "That thing is similar to the little monster inside the egg," Rosemary reminded as she saw the ugly expression on everyone's face. Ian's expression was gloomy. "I know. That one just hatched a while ago. It's much bigger than the other one. Probably hatched a while ago. At the very least, it hatched before we entered this place." Martin clenched his fists as he looked at Luna. "Damn bastard. It has been lurking around here. It dared to attack us in front of so many people." Rosemary frowned and said, "Luna couldn't stand the smell of the egg, so she stood a bit behind us and fell far away. She was defenseless, so she was able to get the egg. From now on, we can't split up anymore. We must leave this place as soon as possible." "Leave?" Martin looked at her. "Do you want Luna to die in vain?" Rosemary was startled. Ian looked at Martin and was silent for a moment. "It can attack Luna successfully. Its strength is extraordinary. Moreover, it is good at hiding. It will be very difficult for us to kill it." Martin was angry. "Are we not going to help her get revenge? There are so many of us. Why should we be afraid of it? If you really want to leave, then leave. Anyway, I will kill it. I have seen its actions. In addition to sneak attacks, it may not be able to defeat any of us. I don't believe that we can't lure it out." Ruby wanted to say something but hesitated. He thought for a moment and said, "I also agree with Martin. The 5 of us together are more than enough to kill it. We can't let Luna die in vain." Ian frowned as he saw Ruby agree. He sighed and nodded. "All right, let's kill it first." Dean saw that they were going to stay to avenge Luna. He felt that it was funny. "I think we should leave immediately. Even if we kill it, Luna won't be able to resurrect. Instead, it will consume our strength. If one of us is injured, it will be more dangerous on the way back. We might even sacrifice ourselves." Martin glared at him and said, "Shut up. What does a newbie like you know?" Dean's eyebrows rose. Ian didn't want to quarrel at this time. He waved his hand. "Don't talk too much." He looked at Dean. "Luna is one of our team members. She has performed several missions with us. In short, our lives have been saved by her. Of course, we have also saved her. It's the first time for you to perform a mission, so you can't understand it. But I hope you can understand it." Dean had a feeling that he was about to laugh. He suppressed his anger. "I can understand your feelings, but the situation is more complicated than you think. This thing hatched before we entered, and we have been here for 5 days. We have been alone for 5 days. Such flaws are enough for it to attack, but it didn't. What does this mean? It means that it isn't an ordinary monster but a monster with a certain level of wisdom. The most important thing is that it didn't choose to attack at that time. But it chose to attack now. It is not because of Eugene's death, but because it has grown up. Ian was startled. Dean continued. It has grown to the extent that it thinks that it can hunt us. That's the main reason why it chose to attack now. In the last 5 days, it has been lurking in the dark and observing us. We have been in close contact with it many times, but we didn't notice it. Even if we felt a trace of abnormality, we would deny it. Rosemary and Ruby's face turned ugly. They found that the situation was as Dean had said. They had been in the same room with the unknown monster for the last 5 days. They were in a state of death at any time. The monster didn't attack them. It was obvious that it was observing their every move. Both of them felt their scalp tingle. Cold sweat oozed out of their bodies as they thought of this. Chapter 534. Dean continued. Luna was about 10 meters away from you and I was about 15 meters away from you. Logically speaking, this thing should have attacked me first. It would be beneficial for it to retreat. But it took the risk to attack Luna, who was closer to you. It means that it had observed the battle between Eugene and me. It didn't think that it would be able to attack me, so it chose Luna. This shows that the intelligence of this thing isn't an ordinary monster. If you really want to avenge Luna, then the only way is to burn down the nest. That way you can definitely force it out. But if you do that, not only will you lose all the eggs, but the flame will also alarm the big guy above. When that time comes, no one will be able to leave alive. Ian and others were startled as they looked at each other. Dudien's statement was reasonable and they couldn't refute it. Especially Rosemary and Ian, who wanted to leave. They were worried about this point, but it wasn't clear. At the moment when Dean raised it, it was like a wake-up call. They realized the seriousness of the matter and knew that they couldn't be emotional here. Martin was silent as he saw Ian looking at him. He knew that it was time for him to express his stance. He looked up and glanced around the dark cave. There was a trace of deep sorrow in his eyes as he whispered, "If you want to leave, then wrap up Luna's body and take it out. I'm afraid that she will become the food of this beast if we leave her here." Ian and Rosemary heaved a sigh of relief when they saw him relent. Ian nodded and said, "Of course." He took out a foldable storage bag from his backpack and covered Luna's body from head to toe. He zipped it up and sealed it. Then he turned to Ruby and said, "Load the small one, we're leaving now." Ruby nodded, carried the empty backpack, and walked to the previous broken egg. It was only a short distance of more than 10 meters, but he suddenly became a little nervous as he walked, as if the monster on both sides of the darkness would rush out at any time. Suddenly, something was placed on his shoulder. Ruby jumped and turned around in fright. Martin walked over with an indifferent expression and said, "I'll accompany you." When Ruby saw that it was him, he breathed a sigh of relief and forced a smile. In his heart, he wanted to say, "Are you trying to scare me to death?" But he felt that it would be too cowardly to say it, so he held back. Soon, the two came to the broken egg. Ruby handed the torch to Martin, shook his backpack, took out the protective gloves inside and put them on. Just as he was about to take out the little monster in the broken egg, he was stunned when he bent down. Martin urged, "Hurry up." Ruby swallowed a mouthful of saliva and bent his body even lower. He moved his head closer to the broken egg and looked around, but there was nothing inside except the sticky liquid that emitted a strange smell. The little thing that had been sleeping inside was gone. How was that possible? Ruby, somewhat alarmed, straightened up and said to Martin, "Lower the torch." Martin saw his strange expression and was slightly startled. He suddenly realized something and passed the torch to the egg. When he saw the scene inside, his expression changed and he said, "It's gone. How is this possible?" Dean, Ian, and Rosemary heard their words. They immediately rushed over. Dean looked into the egg and found that in addition to the fishy egg liquid, he did not see the previous little thing. His face changed slightly, and there was a strange feeling of horror in his heart. Rosemary stared blankly at the egg and said, "Could it be that this thing can move in that form?" Ian was startled for a moment. His face suddenly became pale. I'm afraid that's not all. Not only can it move, but it also knows how to camouflage. When we saw it, it was pretending to be dead. But when we left, it took the opportunity to run away. Could it be that the thing that attacked Luna deliberately did that? In order to divert our attention? Ruby was shocked. How is it possible? It was cut by Eugene's sword. If it was a premature baby like us, it would be good if it didn't die. How could it pretend to be dead? Dean stared at the ground next to the egg. He could vaguely see the traces of the egg slipping along the ground until it reached the rock wall. When he saw it, his expression changed slightly. There was an obvious mark left behind by the monster from before on the rock wall. This meant that this little one was most likely saved by that monster. Rosemary came back to her senses and hurriedly said, "We can't stay here any longer. If these eggs hatch, I'm afraid." She was afraid that they wouldn't be able to leave. Ian understood what she meant and made a prompt decision. "Pack up, we're leaving this place immediately." Martin glanced at the eggs scattered all over the ground and said, "These things are a scourge in the end. Why don't we destroy them all before we leave?" Ian was startled. "If we destroy them and report to the family, then we won't be able to get the medal," Martin said. "But if we return to the family and report to the family, then we will have to wait for the pioneers to come and pick them up. It will take too long. If some of these things have hatched and we come to the wasteland again in the future to perform the task, then the possibility of encountering these things will be very high. It will be more dangerous." Dean glanced at him. He didn't expect this man to not be blinded by greed, but to think very far. But it was obviously unnecessary. They were not the only team that came to the wasteland. With the growth and destructive power of these things, once they attracted the attention of the family, they would certainly send pioneers to clean them up. If they were destroyed, then they wouldn't get anything. For them, it would be the biggest loss. Of course, the price of doing this was to put other teams in danger and pay a heavy price. "Let's talk about the future in the future." Ian pressed on Martin's shoulder and said in a deep voice, "You've seen the potential of this thing. It's very likely to be a new type of monster. The family is likely to reward us with a lot of medals, which is equivalent to the sum of 10 missions we've completed. We can also use this opportunity to get rid of this endless battle." Martin glanced at him. After a moment of silence, he nodded slightly and said, "I understand." Ian no longer delayed. "Let's go up." Dean looked at the more than 20 meters high hole above his head. Who can jump up? Such a height had exceeded the jumping height of ordinary Limitless. Rosemary said, "I will do it." Her body shook slightly. Her bones made cracking sounds as she crouched on the ground in a strange posture like a praying mantis. Then she jumped up and directly bounced up to the top of the hole. After climbing up the hole, Rosemary threw down the rope that Luna had used to climb up the hole. Dean was not polite. He jumped up and grabbed the rope before it fell and quickly climbed up. Ian and Martin were startled. They suddenly realized a problem. Their faces slightly changed. But it was impossible to stop Dean. At this moment, Dean was climbing up the rope to the top of the hole. Ian and Martin were silent. They quickly climbed up the rope. Ruby was at the back. He was a little nervous. He swallowed his saliva and climbed up the rope with both hands. Chapter 535. Hurry up, Ian urged as he squatted at the edge of the hole. Ruby didn't need to say anything. He grabbed the rope at the same time as Ian went up. His other hand was holding the torch, and his feet were rubbing the rope as he climbed up. Suddenly a gust of wind came from nowhere. The flame on the torch fluttered slightly as if it was going to be extinguished. There was a trace of panic in Ruby's heart. He couldn't help but turn his head and look around. In the gloomy darkness around him, it seemed that the thing would suddenly jump out. Thinking of the horrible scene of Luna's death, his throat moved slightly. He didn't dare to stay any longer. He pulled the rope with one hand and quickly climbed up. When he was halfway up, there was a sudden whoosh sound. Ruby's pupil shrank as he looked at the source of the sound. He saw an arrow shooting straight from the top of the hole. It brushed past the edge of the torch, and the airflow made the flame erratic. Clang! The arrowhead seemed to hit the metal surface, making a sharp sound. "It's behind you!" Ian hurriedly shouted. "Come up!" Ruby's face turned pale. He didn't look back like a fool. He didn't even take the torch in his hand. He quickly grabbed the rope with both hands and climbed quickly. In the blink of an eye, he rushed to the top of the hole. Until his palm was caught by Ian, his heart was slightly relieved. Suddenly, he felt as if something was on the sole of his foot, and his body suddenly sank down. No, Ruby was frightened. He hurriedly lifted his other foot and kicked. Whoosh! Another arrow whizzed past. Clang! Ruby only felt that his foot was light. His body suddenly soared up and was pulled to the top of the hole by Ian. He was a little frightened. His dark face was full of cold sweat. He sat on the edge of the hole and turned his head to look at the bottom of the dark hole. It was dark inside. The fallen torch was like a weak flame. It gradually extinguished, and there seemed to be a shadow passing by the flame before it was extinguished. Ruby swallowed his saliva. He only felt that he had a brush with death. He turned his head and looked to the side. He saw that Dean slowly hung the bow on his back. Obviously, the previous 2 arrows were shot by Dean. He didn't expect that Dean would help him. His heart was warm. He gratefully said, "Thank you, thank you." "It's nothing." Dean glanced around. "It's not safe here. This thing is likely to climb out and chase us. We should leave as soon as possible." Ian breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that Ruby was fine. He nodded and said, "That's right. Everyone, apply the powder. Be careful, don't disturb the big guy outside." Martin glanced at Dudian. The hostility in his eyes converged a bit. He took out the undead powder from his backpack and smeared it on his face. He waited for the others to finish disguising themselves and then walked in front. Following the path that they came from, the group's footsteps were silent. They lightly stepped over the skeletons on the ground, not making the slightest noise. As they got closer and closer to the outside of the cave, everyone became more and more nervous. Even Dean couldn't help but hold his breath. He had already planned for the second step. Once the monster was disturbed, he would immediately rush out of the cave. As long as he rushed out of the cave, he could fly away with the help of his wings. Although doing so would expose his ability to the eyes of Ian and others, whether they could survive was still a problem. Moreover, at this moment of life and death, he couldn't care so much. In the dark and damp cave, in addition to the rancid and bloody smell, there was a strange smell. It was a bit like the smell of a corpse soaked in rotten water. It was somewhat similar to the smell of the previous nest under the cave, but there were some differences. Several people gently sniffed and smelled the strange smell. Their expressions were somewhat dignified. They knew that the big guy was not far away. Dean's whole body muscles were tense, ready to rush out at any time. Ian gave Martin a wink, indicating that the thing was probably in the corner in front of them. Martin also sensed that the smell in the air was so strong that it stung his nose. He could sense that the thing was getting closer and closer, and this made him feel quite nervous. He gripped his weapon tightly and lightly stepped forward, not making a single sound. He plucked up his courage and peeped out of the corner of his eye. Dean, Ian, and Ruby suddenly felt that Martin's body was slightly stiff. Their hearts couldn't help but jump, and they were ready to respond at any time. After a while, Martin slowly retracted his head, made a gesture to everyone to keep quiet, and then lowered his body and slowly walked forward. Dean's eyes flashed. He held his breath and quietly followed behind. When he saw the thing behind the corner, he immediately knew the reason why Martin's body was slightly stiff. He saw that in the exit passage behind the corner, there was a huge and terrifying shadow crawling on the ground. It looked like a lizard and a poisonous scorpion with several forked tails. Its whole body was covered with silver scales. It was huge, but its body was slender, just enough to fit into the cave. On both sides of its body there were strange limbs, like spider legs and centipede feet, some long and some short. The moment Dean saw this thing, he felt a sense of horror, but what really shocked him was that he recognized the appearance of this monster. In the Monster Atlas, it was one of the 8 legendary monsters, the Shadow Hunter. This was a super monster that was as famous as the Splitter. Different from the extreme attack type of the Splitter, the Shadow Hunter was good at lurking and sneak attacks. It belonged to the top lurking monsters. To some extent, it was more terrifying than the Splitter. Even monsters that were much stronger than the Shadow Hunter could be killed by its sneak attack. Even some of the strongest human beings couldn't escape its claws. Ian and Ruby were aghast. They also recognized the identity of this monster. They never thought that in this orange wasteland, they would encounter a legendary monster that was hard to come by in 100 years. A trace of greed flashed in Ian's eyes, but it was quickly covered by fear. He held his breath, and his muscles tightened. In front of the Shadow Hunter, who was good at lurking, their current lurking ability was simply at the level of a newborn child, not worth mentioning. He suddenly felt a little regretful. If he knew this big guy was the legendary Shadow Hunter, he would rather starve to death in the nest than come out. But now that he was already halfway there, he could only bite the bullet and continue. He could only pray that this Shadow Hunter was sleeping soundly enough and wouldn't be woken up by them. It looks like a mature Shadow Hunter with a hunting level of 64 to 67. Dean glanced at the form of the Shadow Hunter. The Monster Atlas had a relatively simple record of legendary monsters, only depicting the mature and complete stages. He suddenly noticed that the silver scales on the Shadow Hunter's body were similar to the shape of the silver scales he saw when he entered the cave. In addition, this Shadow Hunter's extremely ferocious triangular head was also somewhat familiar, very similar to the terrifying monster that hatched in the nest. However, the triangular arc on its head was slightly inwardly concave, making the triangular protrusion on its head protrude outwards like a sharp thorn, making it look sharper and more ferocious. Dean immediately understood, and his face turned ugly. Obviously, the whole cave was its territory. The Whisperer and the Blood Sender were mostly the food it captured, and the eggs in the nest were the Shadow Hunter cubs it gave birth to. However, the shape of the Shadow Hunter they met before was different from this one, so they didn't think of this for a while. After all, monsters would undergo a metamorphosis at every stage, and some of the metamorphoses would be so drastic that they would no longer resemble their previous appearance. Dean had a kind of terrifying feeling when he was brought back to the nest by the Splitter. His eyes slowly shifted to the cave in front of him. Not far behind this Shadow Hunter was the cave exit. As long as he rushed out, he could escape with the help of his wings. Just a little bit more. He moved forward cautiously. Crack! Suddenly, a soft sound came from behind. Martin and Ian were fast approaching. Dean came back to his senses, and his heart suddenly moved. He didn't follow his previous idea of stepping out of the cave and spreading his wings. Instead, he turned around and ran down the mountain. But he couldn't help but have some doubts in his heart. Was this Shadow Hunter really sleeping soundly? If the commotion caused by Ruby didn't wake him up, then the sound of them running at full speed should have woken him up, right? In the blink of an eye, Dean had rushed to the foot of the mountain. When he passed by the body of the corpse pecker, he saw a few colorful insects lying on the body and gnawing on it. They were bloodthirsty insects that were common in the forest. Their hunting level was low, but they could secrete toxins. If one was not careful, even a senior hunter would suffer in front of them. Dean saw Ian and Martin rushing down one after another. His attention was focused on them, but he didn't see Ruby following him. He also didn't feel the movement of the Shadow Hunters. He was a little relieved, and his eyes fell on Ian. Although he could understand Ian's mood at that time, if it wasn't for his quick reaction, this behavior would have put him to death. Seeing Dean's unfriendly face, Ian's face was a little ugly. If it wasn't necessary, he really didn't want to be enemies with Dean. You guys come quickly." Suddenly, Ruby's voice came from the mountain. It was not the fear they imagined, but full of shock and even a hint of surprise. The three of them were startled. They looked at each other and looked up at the mountain, but they didn't move. No one could be sure whether this would be a trap set by Ruby, who was lagging behind, to get them to go back and help him. "You guys come quickly. This legendary monster is dead, it's dead." Ruby's voice came from the deep grass. With a rustling sound, the grass was pushed away by his burly body. His head was full of sweat, but his face was red, and he looked very excited. Dean was startled. A lot of information suddenly flashed in his mind. His heart jumped, and he quickly rushed toward Ruby, then swept past him and returned to the cave on the mountain. Ian and Martin were startled for a moment. They didn't expect Dean to be so courageous. He dared to return to the horrible lair just because of Ruby's words. If he deliberately lied to retaliate against Ian's previous behavior, wouldn't he take the initiative to go back and die? While the two were hesitating, Ruby saw Dean go back, so he immediately turned and followed him back. Seeing this scene, the two were taken aback. They looked at each other and immediately saw the shock in each other's eyes. Could it be that what Ruby said was true? The two couldn't care so much, and quickly followed Ruby back to the mountain. As soon as they arrived at the open space, they saw Dean standing in front of the cave, looking inside. But the shadow hunter didn't rush out to chase them. Thinking of this, the two showed a bit of excitement on their faces and immediately came to the cave. Dean stared at the shadow hunter inside, and his eyes suddenly showed shock. His judgment was right. Ruby didn't lie. This shadow hunter was really dead. On its back, there was a hole with a diameter of nearly 1 meter, and the silver scales on its surface were completely shattered. The injury was extremely serious, and judging from the location, it was also a fatal part. It was actually dead. The shadow hunter, known as the best at hiding among the legendary monsters, actually died in its own lair. Dean was shocked. The reason why he dared to come back was mainly because he thought of his previous inference. The ovaries under the cave obviously belonged to this shadow hunter. It didn't make sense for it to sleep here. Moreover, until he rushed out of the cave, this shadow hunter didn't chase them. If he added the conclusion that it was dead in front of these doubtful points, everything could be explained. He suddenly thought of the movement they heard when they fell into the ovaries while digging the soil 5 days ago. At that time, the last sound they heard was a roar, and then it completely stopped. I should have thought of it earlier. What kind of monster would roar like that when it's asleep? It must have been attacked at that time, and it was this fatal attack. In other words, it was dead at that time. Dean's face changed. Although the shadow hunter's death was a good thing for them, and they didn't have to run for their lives, didn't this mean a more terrible thing? At that time, in this cave, there was something more terrible than this shadow hunter. What was it that could kill this shadow hunter with one blow? After all, this was a mature legendary monster. Although its hunting level was only between 64 and 67, its actual combat ability was comparable to that of a normal monster with a hunting level of over 100. Moreover, with the shadow hunter's superb lurking ability, it was actually killed by another monster. It was simply inconceivable. If that thing had already set up an ambush before it entered the cave and launched a sneak attack, then it wouldn't make sense. After all, in terms of ambush, the shadow hunter was the best in this field. Dean's face was ugly. Suddenly, for the first time, he felt that in this world outside the giant wall, his life was not under his control. Fortunately, that thing didn't take a fancy to them. Otherwise, with this kind of skill, it would be easy to kill them. At this time, Ian and Martin also came to the side of the cave and looked inside. Soon, their faces were filled with horror. Chapter 537. Ian and others couldn't help but look at Ruby next to him. Ruby glanced at Ian, and a trace of resentment flashed in his eyes, but he quickly restrained it. He knew that if he questioned Ian at this time, he would absolutely not have a good ending. In this wasteland outside the wall, except for Dean, Martin and Rosemary would definitely be led by Ian. Even if he was in the right in this matter, Ian wouldn't be biased towards him. After all, reason was nothing in front of benefits. He took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "I panicked when I saw that you were running so fast and I accidentally fell. When I got up and looked back, I saw the big hole on its back. That's when I knew that it was probably dead." Hearing this, Dean nodded. Suddenly, his heart moved and his eyes slightly narrowed. Although he didn't look back, his eyes fell on Ian, Martin, and Rosemary. Because he was facing Ruby, he immediately saw Ian, Martin, and Rosemary exchanging glances. Dean slightly sneered, secretly gathering his strength, ready to attack at any time. Although this shadow hunter was dead, its body was a big treasure, especially the legendary magic mark in its body, which was even more valuable. From the look of the three people exchanging glances, it was obvious that they intended to kill him first. Ruby noticed the look of the three people, and his face slightly changed. He suddenly gritted his teeth and said to Dean, "Let's cooperate." "Cooperate?" Dean slightly raised his eyebrows, looking at him, and suddenly understood something. "They want to deal with you, so let's cooperate. I'll give you the legendary magic mark in this shadow hunter's body, and after we go back, we'll report the lair inside to the family, and we'll split the medals 50-50. How about it?" Ruby stared at Dean's eyes. He had already gone all out. Ian's previous treatment of him was mostly to prevent him from holding a grudge. Even if he survived this crisis, it would be difficult for him to mix in the team in the future, and he would gradually be marginalized. Even during some missions, if the other party used a little trick, his corpse would be exposed in the wilderness. Therefore, he had to risk it. Dean glanced at him and nodded. "Okay." Ian and the other two people's faces slightly changed, looking at Ruby with surprise and anger. Martin angrily shouted, "Bastard, do you know what you're talking about? We are a team, how can we kill each other?" "Yeah, Ruby, don't be silly," Rosemary said hurriedly. Ian looked at Ruby apologetically and said, "I'm really sorry before. I was anxious and didn't notice you. I'm really sorry." Upon hearing this, Ruby's heart turned colder. If Ian admitted it generously, he might still have some doubts. However, Ian said that he didn't mean it. If he really believed it, he would be an idiot. Dean turned to look at the emotional performance of the three. "Didn't you say that you are life and death teammates? But when you were escaping you actually tried to kill me. Is this your friendship?" Ian's expression changed slightly. He looked at him coldly and said, "What do you mean by that? You want to keep this legendary parasitic soul worm for yourself?" Ian indifferently said, "Speaking of this, it should be you who want to take everything for yourself. Are you sure that he will let you go back alive? If he can do such things to me and Ruby, then he can do the same to you. Or are you planning to kill me and Ruby, then deal with the others? Or are you planning to take the opportunity to kill them in the process of besieging me and Ruby? Or are you secretly saving your strength and waiting for the end of the battle to kill your exhausted teammates?" "Nonsense!" Ian shouted angrily. He was so angry that his body trembled slightly. At the same time, there was a trace of fear in his heart. He glanced at Rosemary and Martin beside him and secretly became vigilant. Although he knew that Dean's words were deliberately to drive a wedge between them, his heart still involuntarily trembled because what Dean said was very likely. At this time, in front of the temptation of two treasures, a legendary parasitic soul worm and a legendary monster's ovary, it was hard for him to believe anyone else. Martin's and Rosemary's faces turned slightly pale, and cold sweat overflowed from their temples. Looking at the smiling and indifferent young man in front of them, they felt a trace of fear and dread. With just a few words, he had made their team, which had just secretly formed an alliance, leave the table. Such a mouth was better than the sharpest blade. Don't listen to his nonsense. He is deliberately driving a wedge between us. If we fight alone, we are most likely not his opponent. We have to fight together. Ian gritted his teeth and said. Martin and Rosemary glanced at him and nodded slightly, but there was some wavering and vigilance in their hearts. They did not dare to completely leave their backs to each other. At the same time, as Dean said, they did not dare to go all out. In case the other two secretly saved their strength after killing Dean, they would not be able to compete with each other. Seeing that Dean was about to speak again, Ian knew that he could not let him speak anymore. He suddenly shouted angrily, "Ruby, why are you not doing it?" Dean and Ruby were startled. If it was an ordinary person, it was estimated that they would instinctively look back or avoid, but Dean's eyes had been paying attention to Ruby. The reason why he was startled was that he did not expect Ian to suddenly say such words, but the next moment, he suddenly thought of beating him at his own game. He turned his head. Ian and the other two saw the opportunity and immediately stepped forward. At this moment, Dean's 270-degree field of vision played a key role. Although he turned his head, he could still see the actions of the three people. His body suddenly turned, and the bones of his whole body became extremely light and ethereal. His body swept like a whirlwind towards Ian, who was rushing in the middle. With a bang, he suddenly raised his hand and chopped at Ian's wrist. Then, with a simple elbow strike, he hit Ian's chest armor. Ian's body was shocked and his face was full of shock. He stepped back a few steps and swallowed the blood that had rushed to his throat. Dean quickly avoided Martin and Rosemary's knife and one-handed sword. His body slid like a loach, and once again opened the distance between them. He returned to Ruby's side and whispered, "Get ready, it is a bit difficult for me to deal with three people alone." Ruby nodded slightly, pulled out his axe and held it tightly in his hand. Ian clenched his teeth, growled, and rushed towards Dean again. Suddenly whoosh! A strong gust of wind suddenly blew, causing the surrounding trees and deep grass to rustle. Then a whistling sound of the wind came from the distant sky. The five people fighting on the ground could not help but divert part of their attention to the sky, and they were suddenly stunned. They saw a huge bat-shaped wing descending from the sky, hanging over the top of the five people, blocking all the sunlight above. A terrible shadow shrouded the top of the five people, exuding the breath of death. When Dean saw the middle body of the huge wing, his eyelids twitched and he was a little shocked. This was not a monster, but a human youth. Wing family! Ian and the others saw this person and cried out in shock. Dean was startled, and suddenly noticed that the style of the armor on this person was a bit strange. It was completely different from the pattern of the dragon family, and the color was darker. On the chest of the armor, there were two flying wings floating in gold, and the veins were clear. He waved his saber and slashed at the youth of the wing race. Seeing this, Ruby's expression changed slightly, knowing that he was serious. Puff! Suddenly, the sound of flesh tearing echoed. Blood spurted out, and a head floated in front of Ruby and Dean. It fell to the ground and rolled 4 or 5 meters away. It was Martin's head. There was a trace of astonishment on his face. Everyone's expression changed. There was a trace of shock in Dean's eyes. Although he expected that the youth of the wing race was extremely strong and not an ordinary pioneer, he didn't expect that he was so strong. Cold sweat overflowed from his back, and his whole body was stiff. This was the feeling of being locked by a murderous aura. He was like a frog being stared at by a poisonous snake. He didn't dare to jump or move, lest he disturb the time, because the next moment would be his death. Ian, Rosemary, and Ruby's pupils shrank, and their faces were full of horror. They didn't expect that the strength of the youth of the wing race was so terrifying. They suddenly understood why Dean retreated. It was not because he wanted them to fight and consume their strength, but because Dean's thermal vision ability had seen clearly from the beginning that the strength of the youth of the wing race was not something they could resist. Ian's teeth were chattering as he stared at the young man of the wings race walking towards him. His heart was pounding like crazy. It was as if the young man's light footsteps were stepping on his heart with every step. Ian's hand that was holding his weapon was frozen. The strong pressure from the young man was like an invisible hand that tightly gripped his body, making it impossible for him to move. His palms trembled slightly, and he slowly moved his feet. Before the youth of the wing race came over, he tried to move to the side, making way for the youth. At this moment, the legendary magic mark of the Shadow Hunter was no longer in his mind. There was only fear and a strong desire to survive. Rosemary followed closely behind Ian to make way. Her face was pale, and she didn't dare to look directly at the youth's face. The youth of the wing race looked straight ahead and ignored the two people. He went straight into the cave and walked toward the huge corpse of the Shadow Hunter. Seeing the youth enter the cave, Ian was relieved. He slightly gathered strength on the soles of his feet, and just as he was about to escape, he suddenly heard the voice of the youth. "Don't rush to leave. I still have some questions to ask you. If you don't want to die, be obedient." Ian's face changed slightly. He looked out of the corner of his eyes, but he saw that the youth didn't look back. Instead, he came to the front of the Shadow Hunter and squatted down, looking up and down at the Shadow Hunter. Although he gave his back to the youth, Ian didn't have the slightest idea of sneak attack. He even had a feeling that once he escaped, he would be immediately caught and killed by the youth. Dean saw that Ian, Rosemary, and Ruby were all scared and gave up the idea of escaping. There was a trace of disappointment and even annoyance in his heart. He wanted to wait for Ian and the others to escape, and then he would also take the opportunity to escape. As long as they ran separately, he didn't believe that the youth could catch up with them at the same time. In this way, someone would successfully escape. And if he continued to wait, he didn't need to think to know that the youth would most likely ask questions about the cause of death of the Shadow Hunter. Once the questions were asked, it would be time to silence them. From the behavior of the youth, it seemed that he had long known the existence of the Shadow Hunter. If it was to deal with the Dragon Guards, then he could have killed all of them as soon as he appeared. He would even use the method of sneak attack, which was more secure and ensured that no one was missed. If he came for the Shadow Hunter, then the reason was obvious. There were spies planted by the Wing family in the Dragon Guards or related high-level officials, and they revealed the traces left by the Shadow Hunter in Orange Wasteland No. 3 to the Wing family. That was why the Wing family didn't hesitate to take the risk of sneaking in to look for it. Huh! The youth looked at the fatal wound on the back of the Shadow Hunter and was somewhat surprised. Then he looked at the rest of the body and the surrounding environment, and the surprise in his eyes suddenly turned into shock. There is no trace of a fierce battle, and the wound is fatal. How is it possible? Did something come out from the depths of the wasteland? His face flashed, and he no longer hesitated. He took out a small bottle from his pocket and sprinkled it on the wound. Some pale yellow powder floated down. After sprinkling some evenly, he put away the bottle and waited quietly. In the blink of an eye, a few minutes passed, but there was no movement on the wound as he expected. The parasitic soul worm is gone? The youth's face sank and he frowned. Chapter 539. When the Wing family youth sprinkled the powder to lure the parasitic soul worm on the Shadow Hunter's body, Dean and the other three at the cave's exit stiffened. This was an excellent opportunity to escape, but the four of them didn't move. Everyone knew that the first one to move would be hit by the Wing family youth's thunderous attack. The four of them happened to be smart people, but at this moment they were like a group of smart pigs. No one wanted to be cannon fodder and create an opportunity for others to escape. The final result would only be to be killed one by one. Ian felt his throat was a little dry. He swallowed his saliva stiffly, and cold sweat poured down his back. He knew what would be waiting for them once the Wing family youth collected the parasitic soul worm. However, he also knew that the first one to escape would never have a good ending, Therefore, he could only endure. When others couldn't bear it anymore, it would be his opportunity. However, he was obviously not the only one with such an idea. Time passed second by second. Every second felt especially long, and it gave people a kind of painful feeling of torment. Dean's face was ugly. If the situation continued to be deadlocked, they would die. However, no one could break this deadlock. Even if he had a full of ideas, there was nothing he could do. He suddenly discovered that the real deadlock was human nature. He no longer pinned his hopes on Ian and the other two. His vision slowly shifted to the surroundings, and his thoughts turned quickly. Suddenly, his eyes narrowed slightly, thinking of the only chance to survive at the moment when the Wing family youth collected the parasitic soul worm. He should immediately escape. When he was collecting the parasitic soul worm, the possibility of the Wing family youth chasing them was the lowest, and it was the only chance at the moment. He couldn't continue to fight with Ian and the other two. Everyone was afraid of death, and no one was willing to make the first move. The final result would only be total annihilation. However, after a few minutes, the Wing family youth, who noticed that the parasitic soul worm was no longer in the Shadowhunter's body, slowly got up, turned around, and walked out of the cave. Dudian was stunned as he saw this scene. He didn't notice when this person collected the parasitic soul worm. Could it be that his speed was so fast that his vision couldn't keep up? Or, he didn't collect it at all? Or, there was no parasitic soul worm in the Shadowhunter's body? You guys! The Wing family youth's expression was much colder than before. He said while walking, "Who has the parasitic soul worm?" Ian and the other two were stunned. Dean thought of the speculation in his heart and instantly reacted. Out of survival instinct, he pointed at Ian. "It's on him." Ian was shocked by Dudien's reaction. He saw Dudien's finger pointing at him. His face turned pale as he said in a hurry, "No, it's not on me. He is slandering me." "Is that so?" The young man of the Wings race looked indifferent as he walked towards Ian step by step. He slowly stretched out his hand and said, "Give it to me." Ian looked at him in horror. There was a suffocating feeling of fear. He suddenly realized that it was useless to explain. This Wing family youth might not believe Dean's words, but for the latter, they were all lambs waiting to be slaughtered. It was just that the order was different. If he couldn't find the parasitic soul worm on him, he would look for them one by one. However, he was the first one to be slaughtered. Thinking of this, his cheeks twitched slightly, and his expression became a little distorted. He clenched his teeth and suddenly threw out the saber in his hand. It shot towards the youth like a flash of silver light. At the same time, he raised his hand and punched towards Rosemary, who was beside him. He wanted to push her towards the youth to buy time for himself. He knew that for the Wing family youth, Rosemary was also an ant that could be killed at any time. But Rosemary would most likely resist, even if this resistance could buy him one more second. However, at the same time that Ian threw out his punch, Rosemary, who had been motionless, suddenly twisted her body and dodged the punch with a weird posture that was impossible for a human body to perform. She then grabbed Ian's wrist and dragged him into the cave. She then turned around and rushed toward the foot of the mountain in the blink of an eye. Ian was dumbfounded. The moment his body fell forward, his mind went blank. Dean and Ruby reacted instantly. Although they were surprised by this instantaneous change, they did not stop and immediately ran toward the foot of the mountain. Although they could avoid being caught by the Wing family youth by using different routes to escape, they were familiar with the route to the foot of the mountain. Moreover, this route was the smoothest, which could maximize their speed. All three of them wanted to fight for this route. For a time, all three of them ran toward the same place. Ian fell to the ground with his hands on the ground. Before he could get up, a foot stretched out from the ground in front of him. His whole body suddenly stiffened. He raised his head in a daze and looked up at the Wing family youth in front of him. The Wing family youth lifted Ian's body. To be precise, He lifted Ian's shoulder like an eagle lifting a chick. He glanced at Dean and the other two who were rushing down the mountain. Ian's heart was beating wildly. He slightly opened his mouth and said, "Sir, I can tell you." His voice came to an abrupt stop. The Wing family youth's other hand pinched Ian's face and gently twisted it. With a crack, Ian's cervical vertebra suddenly broke. Until the last moment of his death, Ian did not have the courage to fight. Whoosh! Throwing away Ian's body, the Wing family youth's figure suddenly swayed and disappeared from the place. In the rugged foothills, 3 figures rushed out quickly. Gradually, one of the figures approached the slender figure in the front at an astonishing speed. It was Dean. Whoosh! 2 thin wings suddenly stretched out from the gap of the armor on his back. They were translucent like the wings of insects. The frequency of the wings was so high that it was almost impossible to see them with the naked eye. Propelled by the wings of the splitter, Dean's body was like a ray of black light. He instantly surpassed Rosemary, who was in the front, and then in the blink of an eye, he left the 2 of them far behind and reached the foot of the mountain first. Courting death. Dean did not look back, but his eyes were looking at the back. He knew that the 2 of them would be caught sooner or later. The next problem was to find a way to get rid of the Wing family youth's pursuit. However, one of the trump cards he relied on, the flying wings, happened to be restrained by the Wing family youth. With the size of the huge bat wings, the speed of the latter's flying might be far faster than his. Moreover, the latter came from the Wing family, so he most likely had some special flying skills. Suddenly, a scream came from behind. Chapter 540. Damn it! Dean clenched his fists and rushed forward, but his heart was getting colder and colder. If he continued to run like this, he would only delay the time of death. He couldn't get rid of the Grim Reaper chasing him. "I can't fly and I can't run on land. I must find a way to hide. If I continue to run, I will be caught sooner or later." Dean's whole body was tense, and cold sweat was pouring out. His mind quickly flashed through the hiding methods he was good at, but they were rejected one by one. It was the first time they met, and he was not familiar with the ability of this youth. If the latter had thermal vision, even if he drilled into the quagmire, he would still die, and his death would be even more ridiculous. Ah! Suddenly, another scream came from behind, but it was a female voice. It was Rosemary. Dean's heart tightened. This voice was closer to him. His pupils shrank slightly, his face was pale, and his heart was burning with anxiety and despair. He felt that death was approaching him step by step. In this situation where there was no information, there was a sense of powerlessness and despair. Moreover, the tight time did not allow him to think slowly. His mind was suddenly in a mess, and he was a little confused. Although he was calm enough, in this extremely desperate and urgent situation, it was difficult for his mind to think effectively. If only I knew his ability, if only I knew his ability. Dean thought painfully and anxiously. Suddenly, he was startled. A few fragments flashed in his mind, and his chaotic thoughts suddenly became clear. Without hesitation, he instantly pressed the lock on the backpack. With a clatter, the backpack fell with his body shaking and fell on the dusty broken road under his feet. The sound of canned food and water came from inside. Dean only felt that his body was a little lighter, and the speed of his feet was a little faster. His wings should be one of his abilities. While speeding up, Dean's thoughts quickly peeled off the clues. Unlike Splitter's wings, which have a short gliding effect, his wings are specially suitable for flight. This should be an inherent parasitic soul worm cultivated by his family, which is suitable for flying. This kind of parasitic soul worm is usually accompanied by keen vision. Previously, he saw the shadow hunter's body in the cave at a glance, so he should have night vision. To be able to find the cave in the dense jungle, it should be high magnification vision or thermal vision. His back was facing Ian earlier, but he sensed that Ian wanted to run. Maybe it was a psychological guess, or maybe he's like me and has a wide field of vision, but it's also possible that his hearing is extremely sharp, and he sensed that when Ian stepped on the ground, it was extremely small. That's how he deduced Ian's plan. Thinking of this, Dean's eyes flashed. From the current clues, this Wing family youth had night vision, suspected high magnification vision and thermal vision, and suspected keen hearing. As for the sense of smell, there were no clues for now. In any case, Dean could only take these possibilities into account. After all, there was only one chance. Only, if these suspected abilities were taken into account, there would be too many things he had to take precautions against. This way, there would be no way for him to hide. Whoosh! Dean's feet suddenly left the ground. The wings on his back fluttered rapidly, and he flew forward at a low altitude. Although the wings of the splitter were gliding boosts for the splitter, for someone of his size, they were enough to be used as flying wings, allowing him to soar tens of thousands of meters. At this moment, he flew straight down the street. He lowered his height, picked up a stone from the ground, and threw it in another direction. With a bang, the stone fell on an adjacent street. While Dean flew forward, he looked back. His pupils shrank to the extreme, and his thermal vision was exerted to the maximum. He felt his eyes were as hot as blood. Suddenly, he saw a bright red figure chasing behind him, quickly approaching him. His face changed slightly. Not attracted by the sound? He immediately landed on the ground, and with the help of the wings, he pressed his body forward to almost touch the ground and rushed forward. His speed was faster than pure flying. While he was trying his best to escape, he felt a chill in his heart. His main purpose of doing this was to test whether the young man's suspected ability was real or not. But now, it seemed that the young man's thermal vision was almost certain. Only in this way could he explain that the Wing family youth did not follow the source of the sound, but chased after him. What should I do? Dean was at a loss for a moment. He suddenly felt that when the thermal vision was tracking the prey, it caused a strong sense of death to the prey. He couldn't get rid of it, couldn't hide. Could it be that he could only wait for him to catch up? All these thoughts flashed through his mind in an instant. Suddenly, Dean thought of something and couldn't help but look at his left hand. Could it be that he could only choose this self-destructive method? With a little hesitation in his heart, he saw the bright red figure getting closer and closer. He suddenly gritted his teeth, no longer thinking, and no longer suppressing the cold feeling in his left hand. Instead, he clenched his left hand and stimulated his muscles. In an instant, the cold condensed in his left hand was like a broken dam, quickly spreading to his whole body. In an instant, his whole body was so cold that he felt like he had lost consciousness, making him shiver. But at this time, shivering obviously affected his speed. He suddenly thought of the scene of poisonous snakes sleeping in winter. Were cold-blooded creatures afraid of the cold? His feet could no longer maintain a stable step forward, so he could only control his feet to leave the ground and fly forward with the wings on his back. At this time, he felt the cold gradually attacking his whole body, including his back. Fortunately, the senses on his wings were relatively slow, so he hadn't noticed the cold yet. As the chill spread, Dean saw that the heat on his body was fading rapidly. It was getting weaker and weaker. Finally, only his heart and the area above his neck were still emitting a faint heat. His thoughts suddenly became a little stiff, just like his body that was frozen. A chill crept up his neck, wanting to rush to his head. Dean suddenly had a feeling of panic in his heart. He hurriedly raised his hand to grab his throat, trying to stop the chill in his body. Parna, who was chasing at high speed, was slightly stunned. In his sight, the heat figure running in front of him suddenly declined rapidly. The exuberant heat became weak until it became a little blurred. Finally, it was blocked by the building, and he couldn't see it at all. Although he could track heat, only heat that was strong enough could be seen clearly when it was blocked by other materials. If it was a very weak life, it would be difficult to see if it was blocked by buildings or thick things. What's going on? He was a little surprised. While escaping at full speed, he could still change his own heat. Was this his magic mark ability? Chapter 541. A bit interesting. Parna narrowed his eyes. This speed is completely inconsistent with the body heat. Is it a higher utilization of the body? It also has the ability of insect wings and can control the body heat when moving at full speed. I have never seen such a magic mark ability. Interesting. Whoosh. His figure suddenly sped up, setting off dust everywhere. Dean's face changed when he saw the wing family youth speed up. He hurriedly waved his wings to speed up, but he felt that his whole body was a bit stiff, as if he would freeze. At the same time, a cold air desperately drilled into his jaw like a viper. He hurriedly clutched his throat tightly, almost unable to breathe. His neck felt like it was about to be broken. Although he didn't know what would happen if the cold air invaded his brain, his intuition told him that he would probably die. He suddenly regretted releasing the cold air in his left hand. At this moment, it was not as easy to suppress it as he thought. It was as if his body was invaded by an angry ice beast. I can't run away. Looking at the bright red figure rapidly approaching, Dean's mind could not help but have this thought, followed by a feeling of despair. He slightly gritted his teeth and dispelled this depressed thought. Suddenly, he thought that his body heat was covered by the active ice blood, so it should be difficult to track him by thermal vision alone. However, the latter was still determined to chase in his direction. Most likely, the wing family youth had other perception abilities. If I can't see with my eyes, then I have to rely on my hearing and smell. If it's smell, the speed of transmission won't be so fast, so there will inevitably be some hesitation. It should be my hearing, Dean quickly thought. His feet were not touching the ground at the moment, so there was no sound of footsteps. The only sound was the subtle buzzing of the wings and the whistling sound caused by his body breaking through the air pressure. Both of these sounds were very light, which meant that the wing family youth's hearing nerves were very sensitive. Although he knew this, Dean had a more depressed feeling. Only the sound could not be eliminated. If he stopped here, the wing family youth would most likely look around and find him sooner or later. 6 kilometers, 5 kilometers. Dean looked at the distance between the two, burning with anxiety. The more anxious he was, the more he couldn't think of any ideas in his mind, and there was no plan in his heart. 3,000 meters, 2,000 meters. Dean looked at the shrinking distance, and his body trembled slightly. Suddenly, he saw the end of the street in front of him, entering a suburb. The concrete residential houses in the suburb were almost completely destroyed. Some were broken, and some were knocked down by unknown things. Behind these residential houses was a dark green mountain, which was connected to the mountain in the previous Shadowhunter's cave. This mountain range seemed to surround the city. If one looked down from the sky, it would look like a huge natural basin. Mountain? Dean was startled to see this. Suddenly, his eyes lit up. He landed on the ground and used his wings to propel himself towards the mountain. His legs were already a little slow, and his senses were numb. However, when he saw the youth of the wing race was getting closer and closer, all he could think about was moving forward. His legs kept moving forward, and his body flew forward like an arrow. His posture was tilted forward almost 90 degrees. If it weren't for the wings on his back, he would have crashed into the ground with such an exaggerated diving posture. 1 kilometer. Dean saw the rapidly shrinking distance. His heart beat wildly. This distance would be overtaken in a few seconds. Whoosh. He used all his strength and once again exerted force on his feet, almost exceeding his limit. His figure dashed out like the wind and finally entered the mountain when the distance between the two was about 600 to 700 meters. As soon as he entered the mountain, Dean roared. His voice was like thunder, rolling and quickly returning, making bursts of echoes. Ah ah ah! The roar echoed over and over again, and the echoes were continuous. Huh? Parna was startled when he heard the sudden roar in front of him. Soon, the echoes came. His face suddenly changed. He looked up at the towering mountain in front of him and suddenly realized, I was wondering why this kid would run to the mountain where the monsters like to live. I thought he wanted to use these monsters to stop me, but he actually relied on the mountain's echoes to interfere with my pursuit? You're quite clever, but you underestimate me too much. Parna slightly raised the corner of his mouth. His ultrasonic hearing was his most trusted perception ability, which was more reliable than thermal vision. After all, some cold-blooded monsters could escape the observation of thermal vision. But ultrasonic hearing was different. He could perceive any monster approaching. Even if the monster was motionless, he could still hear their heartbeat and breathing. If the distance was close enough, he could even hear the sound of blood flowing out of their hearts. He immediately stopped and listened attentively. Soon, in a series of echoes, he heard the extremely slight flutter of wings. His eyes suddenly lit up. He locked on the direction and quickly chased after it. After chasing for hundreds of meters, when he was about to enter the mountain, he suddenly thought of one thing. This kid seems to have mastered my ability? The chuckle on his face suddenly disappeared. His eyes narrowed, and a trace of cold, killing intent flashed through them. Whoosh! Parna quickly drilled into the mountain. Chapter 542. Huh! Parna suddenly heard a subtle strange sound coming from the opposite direction of Dean's roar. He frowned slightly and looked up at the source of the sound. The corner of his mouth slightly curled up, revealing a sneer. Diversion? That's a good idea, but it's too clumsy. Whoosh! His figure suddenly flickered, leaping through the forest like an ape as he sped away with the wind. In the blink of an eye, Parna's figure appeared in a dense forest, surrounded by strangely colored spotted trees. At this moment, there was a small gap in front of him with a collapsed tree. Under the tree was a dark cave. The cave was not big, about half a meter in diameter. The size of the hidden monster wouldn't be too big. Parna glanced at the cave and his eyes fell on a huge figure in front of the dense forest. It was a boar-like monster, about 3 meters tall, with spikes all over its body. At this moment, it was rushing forward, constantly groaning, and its voice was mixed with a trace of pain. Parna frowned slightly. Did the sound he heard before come from this monster? His eyes were thoughtful. Silence. Dean felt his heartbeat stop. His body was tightly curled up, and his heart was unprecedentedly nervous. He only hoped that time would pass quickly. Parna, who was in contemplation, suddenly froze. A cold light flashed in his eyes. He looked up at the monster that was about to disappear from his sight. His eyes fell on its abdomen, which was slightly bulging as if it had eaten too much. Humph! Parna slightly sneered. Insignificant skill. His figure suddenly swept across the dense forest like a rock spreading its wings. The soles of his feet stepped on the trees and leaped forward. In the blink of an eye, he caught up with the monster. Bang! His body landed directly on the back of the monster. The violent shaking of the monster's body during the collision did not cause him to lose his balance at all. He lifted his foot and stomped on the ground. With a thump, the huge monster's limbs suddenly turned soft and it fell to its knees. Its knees hit the mountain's soil, and it let out a painful howl. Parna quickly bent over and punched the monster's head. His fist burst out a shock force and penetrated the monster's skull. The demonic creature let out a blood-curdling scream on the spot, its body slowly went limp, and it died. Parna jumped down from the corpse and looked indifferently at the monster corpse at his feet. Come out by yourself. The monster's corpse did not react at all. Parna waited for 10 seconds. Seeing that Dean was still pretending to be dead, he was too lazy to wait any longer. He coldly snorted, Seeing that your brain is still smart, I can consider letting you be a spy of our wing family. How about it? Do you want to die or follow me?" The monster's corpse remained motionless at the bulge in its abdomen. Parna's eyes flashed with a trace of anger. He suddenly raised his hand, and a silver light flashed on his fingertip. Poochie! The abdomen of the monster's corpse suddenly split open. The intestines, stomach, liver, and other internal organs slid out along with blood. Among these internal organs, there was a relatively large object covered with blood. It was actually a big stone. Parna was stunned. Rocks? Was that kid hiding in its stomach? He reacted quickly, and a furious killing intent surged in his eyes. He was actually fooled by a stinking brat who was only in his teens. Damn it! He clenched his fist. If he found Dean again, he would tear this kid into pieces. He quickly restrained the anger in his heart, and his thoughts quickly calmed down. His eyes turned, scanning the surrounding jungle. He carefully looked at every tree, grass, and flower. Suddenly, he saw a dent on the ground. The shape of the dent was the same as the big stone in front of him. A picture automatically emerged in his mind. Dean ran here and stuffed this big stone into the monster's body, causing the monster to flee in panic. At the same time, Dean could attract his attention and lead him away. What a cruel and cunning kid. He narrowed his eyes slightly. After looking around, he didn't find any traces, so he closed his eyes gently. The world suddenly became quiet. He lifted his foot and gently stomped on the ground. After a while, he opened his eyes again and flew in another direction. Whoosh! Seeing the youth leave, Dean was secretly relieved. His body was tightly curled up in the sand in the cave. The cold sand corresponded with the bone-chilling blood in his body. He felt like his whole body was frozen. He restrained his body's instinctive shivering and remained motionless in the mud. He didn't go out. Whoosh! A few minutes later, a breeze passed by and the figure of the youth returned. He turned his head and looked around. He didn't see Dean's figure, so he couldn't help but stomp on the ground. He seemed to be a little angry, and then his body flashed and left again. Dean hid in the sand underground. Although his eyes were closed, his vision could penetrate through his eyelids and he could see the heat source outside. When he saw the youth leave, he was a little relieved. This time, it was likely that the youth really left. He couldn't hold on anymore. His body slowly trembled, and he slowly crawled out of the mud. He crawled along the exit of the little monster's cave, and soon came out of the cave. Breathing the fresh air outside the mud, he felt like he was reborn after death. Willing to come out? Suddenly, a cold voice sounded. Dean's soft, gasping voice suddenly froze. He looked up and saw a figure squatting on a tree next to the cave. It was the youth of the Wing family. He didn't leave? Dean was a little confused. The youth looked at the shock on Dean's face, and the corners of his mouth slightly curled up. There was a kind of happy feeling in his heart, but his expression was indifferent. He said, "You can persist until now. Boy, you're pretty good." Dean looked at him in a daze, and his mind was a little blank. Suddenly, he figured out the reason, and his face suddenly turned ugly. "It seems that you've guessed it." Seeing the change in Dean's expression, the youth's eyes flashed with a trace of surprise. Then he smiled indifferently and said, "You still underestimate me if you want to confuse my hearing. So far, no one has been able to escape from under my eyes." Dean's palms were covered in cold sweat, and his mind was in chaos. He already knew the reason why the youth found him, and that was the echo detection. The youth stomped his feet before, obviously, not because he was angry, but because he used the stomping to transmit the sound to the ground and observe the surroundings through the echo. This ability was usually used on equipment such as submarines in the old era. However, in this world where non-human warriors were born, he could achieve this step by relying on the strength of the human body. This was also his unique ability to test whether someone was telling the truth or not. So, the spies of your rock race have penetrated quite deeply. The news is even one step ahead of our wing race. Parna deliberately mocked, his face full of disbelief. Dean replied, "If you let me live today, then I will pass you the information that we have gathered from the Dragon Clan. Do you think I will believe you?" Parna sneered and said, "Unless you tell me the positions and names of the other superiors of your rock race in the Dragon Clan, then I will consider it." Dean's heart moved. He didn't know if there were any wing race spies among these superiors. If there were, he could say a few names. If it was the wing race's people, then his lie would naturally be exposed immediately. "I only know one," Dean said. "It's my superior. He is Princess Hathaway's confidant. As for the others, I don't know." "What's his name?" Parna stared at him. Dean said without hesitation, "Gately." "Liar!" Parna shouted. Dean was slightly startled, looking at him suspiciously. Seeing Dean's expression, Parna's eyes flashed. He put away the anger on his face and said indifferently, "Thank you for telling me this. Rock race boy, what's your name?" "Dean." "I will remember this name." Parna smiled at Dean. "You are qualified to let me know your name before you die." After that, his figure suddenly moved and jumped down from the tree. Dean's face suddenly changed. He quickly retreated a few steps and looked at him with anger. "You don't keep your word? I have already told you this information. If you kill me, it will not do you any good. If you just want to silence me, then it's even more unnecessary. Even if we die, the Dragon Clan will let our corpses speak. They will know that your wing race has invaded the Dragon Clan's territory. That's not important." Parna walked toward Dean step by step, as if he was taking a stroll in the garden. "I just want to kill you." Dean was stunned. The anger on his face suddenly disappeared, as if he suddenly took off all the camouflage mask. He looked at Parna with a gloomy face and said, "Why?" "I don't like you," Parna said bluntly. This seemed to be an irrefutable reason. Whoosh! At the same time, Parna suddenly took a step forward, and his figure suddenly disappeared like a phantom. Dean's pupils suddenly shrank to the size of a pinhole, and an afterimage flashed in his oppressive eyes. His retreating body suddenly stopped. He suddenly leaned to the side and swung his hand like a whip, striking forward. Bang! Dean's palm shook violently, and the web between his thumb and forefinger cracked. He retreated 7 or 8 steps, feeling the pain in his wrist as if it was broken. He endured the pain and looked at Parna, who was standing in his original position, staring at his chest. There was a shallow scratch on his dark armor. In front of Parna's feet, there was a dagger. It was the dagger tied to Dean's leg. The corner of Parna's mouth twitched slightly, and his eyes slowly burned with anger. Suddenly, a trace of rejoice flashed in his mind. Fortunately, those guys weren't here. Otherwise, if they saw him killing a frontiersman kid and getting his armor pierced, they would laugh at him for the rest of his life. "You really deserve to die." Parna raised his foot and stepped out. The ground slightly sank, and his body suddenly disappeared like a gust of wind. In Dean's contracted pupils, he only saw a shadow that was shallower than before. He hurriedly raised his hand. Whoosh! Suddenly, as he raised his hand, there was a whistling sound between heaven and earth. The shadow in Dean's eyes suddenly stopped, revealing Parna's appearance. He looked up in horror. Seeing Parna's action, Dean couldn't help but look up at the sky. Suddenly, he saw a blood-red light breaking through the sky like a meteor, falling from the sky with a tremendous force, as if to cut off the entire earth. Dean's face was pale. He only felt that his whole body was locked by a huge murderous intention. It seemed that his body would be torn apart and decomposed in the next moment. Bang! The meteor-like blood light suddenly fell in front of Dean. All of this happened in an instant. Dean only felt a huge shock under his feet, and his body slightly swayed. When he focused his eyes, he was immediately stunned, and at the same time, a strong desire to survive surged in his heart. The falling blood-red light was actually a giant sword that was as red as blood. He had seen this sword before. His eyes burst out with blazing light. Whoosh! At the same time as the sword fell, a slender figure quickly fell from the sky. Both feet stood on the hilt of the sword, standing between Dean and Parna, looking down at Parna. It was Aisha, and this blood-red giant sword was Aisha's exclusive sword, blood vessel. Chapter 544. You go back first, Aisha said to Dean behind her without looking back. Dean didn't wait for her to say anything, he had already run far away. You are Aisha? Parna looked at Aisha and narrowed his eyes. Aisha looked down at him indifferently and said, Are these your last words? Parna raised his eyebrows and sneered, saying, Rumor has it that the Holy Maiden of the Dragon Clan is the most talented person in the past 100 years. Now it seems that she is just SOSO. If it was the Holy Son of your Wing Clan who said this, he would be qualified. Aisha was not angry and said indifferently, As for you, the third young master who couldn't even be elected as the Holy Son, aren't you ashamed to say this? Parna's face turned slightly red and he clenched his fist. When he was about to speak, he suddenly thought of something. His face changed slightly and he stared at Aisha fiercely. You want to delay me and wait for support? You are lucky this time. If we meet in the depths of the wasteland in the future, I will definitely pay you back. When he said the last word, his figure had turned into a shadow. Like an arrow leaving the bow, he quickly retreated down the mountain. His speed was several times faster than when he was chasing Dean. Obviously, he didn't chase with all his strength and reserved his physical strength. Otherwise, he would have caught Dean before he entered the mountain. Aisha snorted coldly. Her figure flashed and flew out from the blood-red sword. Like a slender and dexterous shadow, she swept in a straight line through the dense forest. But if you looked closely, you would find that every time she passed a big tree blocking her way, her figure would instantly move sideways, moving forward in a wavy line. However, because the curve around the tree was too fast, it looked like a straight line, chasing Parna in front of her. In the blink of an eye, Aisha's figure had caught up with Parna. As if knowing his intention, she didn't show any mercy and suddenly raised her hand. Parna's face was cold, and he didn't show any fear as he counterattacked. Bang! Parna's eyes showed a trace of astonishment. His body rushed backward uncontrollably. He quickly unloaded the force, but he still broke 2 or 3 big trees before stopping. He only felt that his palm was numb and had lost feeling. His wrist was in extreme pain, and the bones inside seemed to be shattered. How is this possible? Parna climbed up from the ground. He was shocked. Through thermal vision, he saw that Aisha's body heat wasn't much higher than his. Even when she was chasing, she didn't reveal too much heat. Even people who could hide their body heat would find it difficult to hide their body heat in battle. After all, once the body exerted strength, the camouflage would easily fail. However, with this physique that was only slightly higher than his own, the surging force coming from the latter's palm was shockingly strong. If it wasn't for his quick reaction, his palm would have broken on the spot. After Aisha struck with her palm, her body was slightly buffered, and she quickly chased after him again. Parna looked at her quickly approaching figure, and a trace of fear flashed in his eyes. He hurriedly turned around and ran. Whoosh! His body flew through the forest. Because he had been here once before, he had already memorized the general terrain. At this moment, as he fled, he specifically chose the densest part of the forest to run towards. Aisha's speed had to be slightly reduced due to the obstruction of the trees. In the blink of an eye, the two had chased to the foot of the mountain. Although the distance was far, the whole process only took about 10 seconds. Whoosh! As soon as he got out of the forest, the wings behind Parna couldn't wait to spread out. He hurriedly jumped, and his speed soared under the flapping of his wings, quickly distancing himself from Aisha. Parna turned his head and saw Aisha, who had just drilled out of the dense forest, looking up at him. She seemed to have given up the chase. What a monster! Parna breathed a sigh of relief and secretly said in his heart. Suddenly, a murderous intent locked on his back. The dense murderous intent was like a sharp sword, making his whole body's hair stand up. Not good. Just as these two words flashed through his mind, before he could react, a piercing pain suddenly came from his left wing with a puff. He looked at it in horror and suddenly saw a black dagger nailed to the place where the wing connected to the back instead of the wing membrane. Otherwise, the dagger would have directly pierced through. His body shook and almost fell down. He was so scared that he hurriedly endured the pain and stabilized his body. At the same time, he tightly locked his attention on the slender figure on the ground behind him. He didn't dare to be careless. Gradually, he flew further and further away until he could no longer see that figure. Only then did he heave a sigh of relief. Dirty rat! Aisha glanced at him from afar. A trace of coldness flashed in her eyes, but she didn't continue to chase. Although with her real strength, she could easily catch up with this person and kill him, this would expose her third awakening. The rest of the exploration team was not far away. The battle here had probably attracted their attention, and they were rushing here. She withdrew her gaze and turned back to the dense forest. Soon, she saw her closest companion, the blood-baron sword. Next to the sword stood a figure. It was Dean, who had previously run far away. Dean had already seen the Wing family youth flying away from the sky. Although he felt that it was a pity that Aisha didn't kill him, at least his life was saved. It had to be said that there were a lot of bad luck, but occasionally there would be a little good luck. You saved me again. Dean smiled bitterly. Aisha grinned and said, Every time I appear, you seem to be in danger. Dean was a little embarrassed and said, Fortunately, every time you appear, it's very timely. You're lucky. Aisha smiled gently. She stepped forward and grabbed the blood-baron sword. She pulled it out and put it back on her back. The bandage on her back was like a magnet that took the initiative to wrap around the sword. She glanced at Dean and saw that he was covered with mud, including his hair and ears. He looked very embarrassed. She said, Have you been hiding from him? Dean replied, I just hid for a while. It's very good to be able to deal with him for a while. Aisha whispered, This person is the second candidate of the Wing family. His strength is not comparable to ordinary pioneers, especially in terms of perception. The second candidate of the Holy Sun? Dean was surprised. He didn't expect this Wing family youth to have such a big background. Wasn't his identity equivalent to Hathaway's? You're here to perform a mission, right? What about your teammates? Were they all killed by him? Aisha asked. Dean recalled what happened today, especially the intrigue with Ian and the others when he was fleeing. He couldn't help but sigh and said, They should all be dead. Chapter 545. Aisha glanced at Dean and said, Did you meet something when you were on the mission? Dean's heart moved when he heard her sudden question, and he truthfully said, Our mission was to kill a rare monster called Silencer, but after we found the nest of the Silencer, we saw a legendary monster called Shadowhunter. But it was already dead. We didn't know what killed it. We didn't have time to collect its parasitic soul worm when this person appeared. Dead? Aisha was startled for a moment, and her brows slightly wrinkled. She pondered for a moment and said to Dean, Where is its body? Take me to see it. Okay. Dean nodded. Seeing that she wasn't surprised when she heard Shadowhunter, he knew that his guess was right. She already knew that there was a Shadowhunter here. The reason why she asked him was mostly because she thought that the Wing family youth had worked hard to sneak in, so he didn't want to kill the dragon guards. Instead, he had other purposes, so he didn't hide it and chose to tell the truth. Whoosh, whoosh. Dean led the way. Along the way, he saw the bodies of Rosemary and Ruby. Both of them died tragically. Their heads were separated from their bodies, and their bodies fell on the roadside weeds in this wilderness. Some unknown earthworm-like crimson worms were crawling on the severed heads, gnawing on the fresh and delicious brain and blood inside. Both of them had just died, but their bodies became a feast for the strange worms in the wilderness. Dean's face changed slightly. Although his heart was as hard as stone, he suddenly felt the fragility and poverty of life. He had been eating, drinking, and fighting these days. In the blink of an eye, the corpses of these weak, strange insects were exposed to the wilderness and became nourishment for these weak, strange insects. "Are they your teammates?" Aisha followed Dean and said, "Do you want to bring their bodies back? Now you are the only one left in your team. If you bring their bodies, your return journey will be more dangerous." Of course, Dean didn't plan to bring their bodies. Not to mention that he had no feelings for these people. Even if Sergei, Nicotine, and others were here, he wouldn't take the risk to collect their bodies in this situation. From his point of view, the meaning of life was to live. If one was already dead, then life was equivalent to the end, leaving behind only an insignificant shell. Risking his life for such a body was a stupid thing that he would never do. However, this idea was a bit cold-blooded after all. He didn't want to expose it to Aisha. He thought for a moment and said, "Let's cremate them here. Let their souls accompany their ashes to watch over this land where they fought and fought for eternity." Aisha also had the same idea. Dean's words made her feel the same way. She nodded and said, "All right, then cremate them." Dean immediately picked up some withered branches nearby and piled the two bodies together. When he picked up Rosemary's head, the earthworm-like worms that crawled in her head wriggled towards his fingers. Dean felt a trace of nausea and didn't want to touch this strange worm. He picked up a clump of her hair and threw her head on her body. The girl's face was still full of horror. Dean took out a match and ignited the dead branch. After a while, the fire burned, igniting the bodies of Ruby and Rosemary, including the armor on their bodies. Under the roasting of the flames, the earthworm-like worms on their heads let out squeaks and writhed in pain. Some fell off and fell into the flames and were quickly burned to death. Some desperately drilled into the bodies of the dead. Dean watched for a while and knew that it wouldn't be finished in a while, so he said to Aisha, "Let's go." Aisha nodded slightly. The two returned to the previous shadow hunter's nest. Dean vigilantly scanned the surroundings, but he didn't see any other abnormalities. He was a little relieved and said to Aisha, "The shadow hunter is in this cave." At the same time, he looked at the cave entrance and he was stunned. If he remembered correctly, Ian's body seemed to be here, but there was nothing on the ground. What happened? He was puzzled. Suddenly, he thought of the underground nest in the depths of the cave, and he couldn't help but feel a chill. Could it be that the newly hatched shadow hunter inside dragged Ian's body away? Whoosh! At this time, Aisha's figure flashed and appeared in front of the cave like teleportation. She looked inside and suddenly saw the shadow hunter's body lying on the ground. A glimmer of light flashed in her eyes. When she came in front of the huge body, she suddenly saw the eye-catching wound on the body. There were no other wounds near the wound. It seemed to be a fatal blow. Her face changed slightly. She jumped to the shadow hunter's body, stretched out her hand, and gently touched the edge of the wound. Her white fingertips were stained with some thick mucus. She brought it to the tip of her nose and sniffed it. Her pupils shrank. Dean entered the cave and saw Aisha's action. He asked, "Do you know what killed this thing? Isn't the legendary monster the strongest monster? How could it be killed so quickly? Could it be that there are more powerful monsters above this legendary monster?" Aisha jumped down from the shadow hunter's body, and her face became a little gloomy. She said, "Of course there is. In the depths of the wasteland, there are all kinds of monsters. There are even monsters that can destroy the giant wall. If I'm not wrong, the one who killed this shadow hunter should be a legendary hunter." Legendary hunter? Dean was stunned. It was the first time he heard this name, but from the literal meaning, it was quite frightening. "This is a kind of monster in the wasteland. Just like its name, it likes to hunt and kill legendary monsters and other named monsters. It's very fierce. Chapter 546. Seeing that she was about to leave, Dean's heart jumped, and he hurriedly said, "Are you going to look for it? Didn't you say that even if you pioneers encountered it, it would be difficult to escape death?" "I'm talking about ordinary pioneers without bloodline power." Aisha's eyes swept over Dean's shoulder and looked at the dark cave behind him. She said, "This cave should have been dug by the Shadow Hunter. Most likely, there are eggs inside. The Shadow Hunter will only build a cave when it's ready to ovulate. If you have time, you can go inside and check. If there are really Shadow Hunter eggs, remember to move them out and find a place to hide them separately. In this way, they can play the greatest value." "Hide them separately?" Dean was puzzled. "Yes," Aisha said, "the Shadow Hunter is different from other monsters. From the beginning of its birth, its first target is the companions that hatched with it. This is also the survival philosophy of the Shadow Hunter." Dean was stunned. "You mean, the Shadow Hunter that hatches first will kill the companions that hatched later?" Aisha nodded and said, "In this wasteland, you can encounter danger at any time. Even legendary monsters are very weak when they are just hatched and can easily become the prey of other monsters. Therefore, after the Shadow Hunter hatches, it will often lurk in the nest opened by its mother, waiting for its new brothers to hatch. Then it will hunt and eat them, so that it can enter the mature period as soon as possible. This process usually takes about 15 days. In other words, it only takes 15 days for the second mature Shadow Hunter to appear." Dean was startled. From hatching to maturity, it only takes a short 15 days? He felt that it was a bit unbelievable. It took at least 2 months for the splitter to enter the growth period, and this was still under the condition that there was sufficient food supply. And from the growth period to the mature period it took even longer. But this Shadow Hunter only needed half a month to turn a newborn Shadow Hunter into a terrifying monster with a hunting level of more than 60. Doesn't the big Shadow Hunter care about it? They are all its children. How can it watch them kill each other? Dean couldn't help but ask. Aisha smiled and said, "Of course it doesn't care. Monsters are monsters, and we humans are humans. For us, it's not desirable to kill each other, but in their thinking, there is no such concept. The only thing they have is survival." Dean was startled and suddenly understood. He sighed and said, "So, whoever is born first will be the survivor that eats all the remaining eggs." Aisha shook her head slightly and said, "Not necessarily the first. Every newly hatched Shadow Hunter has a layer of amniotic membrane on its body. This layer of amniotic membrane will protect it from the attacks of its companions. When it really enters the juvenile stage, this layer of amniotic membrane will be shed. At that time, it will be a real fight. In each nest of eggs, only one will survive, and this one will follow the mother and establish its own tribe and territory until the next time it reproduces." Dean nodded slightly and sighed with emotion in his heart. Fortunately, he knew this news. Otherwise, this nest of Shadow Hunter's eggs would have been wasted and suffered heavy losses. "I'll go first. Be careful," Aisha said and was ready to leave. Dean quickly said, "Are you sure you can deal with it?" Seeing the worried look on his face, Aisha slightly pursed her mouth, revealing a smile, and said, "It's hard to say. But even if I can't beat it, at least protecting myself is not a problem." Then, she took a step forward and quickly disappeared into the woods outside the cave. Dean looked at her back gradually disappearing. He retracted his gaze and turned to look at the dark depths of the cave. Thinking of the Shadow Hunter hiding in the shadows, a trace of coldness emerged in his heart. He caught a glimpse of Martin's sword on the ground and immediately bent down to pick it up. Then he glanced at Martin's body at the edge of the cave, and a trace of doubt flashed in his eyes. That Shadow Hunter only took Ian's body but didn't take Martin's body. Could it be that it couldn't take 2 bodies at once? If this was the case, Didn't it mean that it had just taken Ian's body and would soon return? Thinking of this, Dean's heart shivered. He picked up Martin's sword, then took off his gloves and put them on his own hand. He glanced at Martin's body, and his eyes flashed for a moment. Finally, he stretched out his hand, lifted Martin's severed head, and entered the cave. After a while, Dean quietly sneaked to the top of the underground nest. He quietly peeked into the hole, but he didn't see the shadow hunter. He breathed a sigh of relief and threw Martin's head down. There was a thud, and Martin's head landed on the sticky floor inside. It rolled twice. The surroundings were quiet. In a blink of an eye, more than 10 minutes passed. Suddenly, a shadow flashed by, and Martin's head, which fell right below the cave, was lifted up and plunged into the depths of the nest. Dean's eyes flashed, and he suddenly jumped down. His eyes immediately locked on the shadow. It was the shadow hunter that killed Luna. Its body quickly climbed up the nest's rock wall like a lizard, and the next moment it disappeared on the rock wall, as if it was integrated into the rock wall. Dean was stunned. He carefully stared at it, but he still couldn't see anything strange. This thing actually disappeared from his sight. He slowly walked toward the rock wall with the sword in his hand. Suddenly, he saw a bit of sticky water slowly seeping out of the rock wall. He couldn't help but be startled. Looking at the traces of the water, he saw the water slowly went up along the rock wall until it reached the top of the rock wall. Dean was startled. Suddenly, his heart moved. This armor was not entirely made of metal, but a mixture of special rubber materials. It was flexible, resistant to radiation, and had a high defense, which was just enough to resist the shadow hunter's blood. Whoosh! His body lost its leverage and fell down. The shadow hunter was stimulated by the severe pain after its tail was cut off. It quickly ran up and disappeared in the blink of an eye. Dean had already tested the strength of this shadow hunter. In addition to its unique lurking ability, which was more terrifying, its frontal combat ability was relatively average. It was similar to a level 40 monster. He didn't want to delay any longer. He stimulated the wings on his back, stomped on the ground, and rushed toward a rock wall. When the rock wall saw Dean rushing over, it quickly returned to the appearance of the shadow hunter and fled to other places. It screamed in horror and despair. Its best ability was ineffective in front of Dean, and its disguise was seen through several times, making it feel like it was suddenly exposed to the sun from the darkness. There was an indescribable fear and awkwardness. Dean's feet touched the rock wall, turned around, and suddenly rushed out. Seeing that it couldn't escape, the shadow hunter screamed in horror and turned to rush toward Dean. Whoosh! A liquid suddenly shot out from its screaming mouth. The speed was extremely fast. Dean's pupils shrank. He spun his wings and stamped his feet on the rock wall. His body suddenly made a 90-degree turn, narrowly avoiding the unknown liquid. He didn't dare to be careless. He quickly approached the shadow hunter, and his sword went straight to its head. The shadow hunter twisted its head, stretched out two plier-like limbs from under its body, and clamped the combat knife. The sword suddenly turned and slashed toward its abdomen. Puff! A scratch appeared on the scales on its abdomen, but it didn't cut its body. Dean was startled. Suddenly, his pupils shrank slightly. He saw that the edge of the sword was a bit blunt. Was it corroded by the previous blood? Dean's face changed slightly. The shadow hunter's abdomen was injured. Although there was no blood, the huge force of the sword made it feel pain. It screamed and crazily rushed toward Dean. Its broken tail swung and wrapped around one of Dean's legs. Its body circled around and rushed toward Dean's chest. Dean reacted. His body slightly swayed, and he raised his leg to avoid the tail. A glimmer of light suddenly flashed in his eyes. At the moment when the shadow hunter rushed toward him, he took a big step forward. His body was half squatting, and he quickly hit the shadow hunter's chest. Puff! Blood suddenly sprayed out. The sword in his hand had pierced into the shadow hunter's abdomen, piercing through its body. Squeak! The shadow hunter screamed loudly, and its body suddenly twisted crazily. Dean hurriedly let go and quickly retreated. The shadow hunter crawled a few steps and wanted to chase, but the blade on its abdomen rubbed against the rock wall, making the wound bigger. It had to stop, looked down at its abdomen, and then looked up at Dean. It opened its mouth and made a baby-like cry, like a wail, but also like a cry for help. Dean frowned slightly. He flapped his wings and floated in the air, waiting for the shadow hunter's blood to flow out. The shadow hunter slowly climbed from the rock wall to the ground. Its body stood upright, and a few claws on its abdomen gently touched the sword. It seemed to want to pull the sword out, but it didn't know how. After repeated touching, it seemed to gradually learn. Its two claws suddenly closed, squeezed the handle of the sword, and suddenly pushed forward. Puff! The sword was pulled out and blood sprayed out, but it quickly stopped. After the sword was thrown out, it fell to the ground. The body of the sword had been seriously corroded and full of holes. Dean's face was gloomy. He didn't expect the shadow hunter to be so tenacious. It could still stand up after suffering such a fatal wound, and it seemed to be slowly healing. He no longer waited, pulled out the dagger at his leg, and suddenly swooped down. The shadow hunter looked up at Dean, and suddenly bared its teeth and roared. It opened its mouth and spat out a few streams of liquid. At the same time, its tongue sprang out like a spring, directly hitting Dean's face. Dean's expression was indifferent. His body suddenly turned in the air and disappeared in front of the shadow hunter. The shadow hunter's ejected tongue didn't hit Dean, and seeing the target disappear, it was stunned for a moment. The next moment it suddenly turned its head. Just as it was about to react, its body suddenly stiffened and trembled slightly. Chapter 548. A cold light flashed in Dean's eyes, and he twisted his palm. Crack! The shadow hunter's carapace made a cracking sound, seeming to loosen up. At the same time, green blood splashed out from the inside, splashing on his hand. The gloves on his hand were corroded, and there was a burning pain, as if a few sparks had fallen on his hand. He quickly retracted his hand and shook off the blood on the glove. At the same time, he kicked the shadow hunter's back, kicking the shadow hunter's body forward. Without waiting for the shadow hunter to get up, Dean quickly followed up with a kick. He raised his leg high and suddenly smashed down, like a black giant axe. The heel wrapped in the alloy boots hit the dagger hilt on the wound. Puff! The dagger was completely inserted into the shadow hunter's neck, and the shadow hunter's body hit the ground, making a loud noise. The shadow hunter screamed and struggled, trying to crawl away. Dean saw that it was so tough, and his eyes flashed coldly. He turned over and smashed down again. Bang! The shadow hunter's head was completely trampled into the ground, creating a football-sized hole. The shadow hunter's head twisted slightly, pulling a few centimeters away from its neck. Its body trembled slightly, and its tail twisted and wound around Dean's foot, coiling like a viper. It tightened slightly, trying to strangle Dean. Dean felt that the strength of the entanglement was not strong, and he was relieved. He knew that the shadow hunter wouldn't be able to live for long. He immediately stepped on the shadow hunter's back with one foot and lifted the other, breaking free from the entanglement of the tail. Then he flapped his wings and rose to the top of the rock wall. He suddenly turned over and stepped on the top of the wall, diving down. At the moment when he was close to the shadow hunter, his body turned 180 degrees, and one foot was shaved off. Bang! The sole of the foot was shaved on the shadow hunter's back, and the sound of bones breaking came. The shadow hunter's head and lower body were slightly raised up, and it screamed and fell down again. Its body was still twitching and shivering, but it didn't try to get up again. Dean saw that it was dying, so he immediately jumped to the side and glanced at the gloves. The blood on the gloves was slowly corroding, especially the metal bar on the back of the gloves, which had been corroded. He sighed, took off the gloves and threw them away. He thought that this shadow hunter should be the most troublesome monster. The battle was not over yet, but its weapons and armor were destroyed. If its vitality was more tenacious, almost no one would dare to provoke it. I don't know if the small one was hidden or eaten by it. Dean paid close attention to the surroundings, quietly waiting, and at the same time recovering his physical strength. Previously, he was chased by the Wing family youth and fought with this shadow hunter. Most of his physical strength had been consumed. Dean suddenly noticed a bag on the ground, not far away. It was the place where Eugene's body was. Eugene's body was gone at the moment. The bag was Eugene's luggage. Was the body eaten by this thing? Dean's eyes moved. He picked up the bag and untied it. Inside were some stored grains and highly purified water, in addition to ropes, hooks, fire sickles, foldable bags, and other survival items. In addition to these things, he also saw a few empty bottles for storing parasitic soulworms, but one of the bottles had something in it. Dean's eyes brightened. He took it out and saw a small parasitic soulworm in the bottle. It was the one taken from the cytoplasmic hunter that Eugene had killed. I almost missed you. Dean raised the bottle and looked at it, revealing a smile on his face. The parasitic soulworm in the bottle seemed to notice Dean. It suddenly stretched out from its curled state and wriggled against the bottle. Its soft feet gently patted the bottle as if it wanted to come out. Dean chuckled. When the matter here is settled, I'll free you. Then he put away the bottle and took out the stored grains and purified water to eat and drink to restore his physical strength. While eating, he always paid attention to the surroundings to guard against another ambush. After he finished eating, the body of the shadow hunter on the ground had stopped trembling and was completely stiff. Dean wiped Martin's sword clean with the bag wrapped in the grains. He held the handle and poked the wound on the body. Seeing that there was still no reaction, he was a little relieved. He used the sword that had been corroded and blunt, and inserted it along the wound on the neck, prying the wound bigger until the whole head was pried off the body. After the head was separated, Dean looked at the blood flowing all over the ground. He squatted down and gently fiddled with the sword, looking for the parasitic soul worm in the body. With the strength of this shadow hunter, it should have reached the growth stage. I hope there are parasitic soul worms in its body. Dean was looking forward to it and was nervous. He carefully searched, and at the same time, he paid most of his attention to the surroundings. After more than 10 minutes, Dean searched all the blood and body, but he didn't see the shadow of the parasitic soul worm. His heart became more and more disappointed. Just as he was about to give up, he suddenly saw a strange blood vessel in the tender flesh of the shadow hunter's head. It was slightly thicker than the other blood vessels around it, like an S shape hovering on the tender flesh of the head. Dean was startled. He carefully picked it up with the tip of the sword and immediately found that it was a parasitic soul worm. However, the parasitic soul worm was motionless, as if it was dead. Chapter 549. Reincarnated beasts usually evolved from non-named monsters. If an unhatched parasite egg was placed on another named monster, it would instead be devoured by the parasitic soul worm of the named monster itself, turning it into the most primitive of nutrients. It would not retain any of its abilities. Dean looked at the parasite egg, his eyes flashing slightly. Although it was an unhatched parasite egg, it was, after all, a legendary monster's parasitic soul worm. Its value was still amazing. If exchanged in the market, it was worth more than 10 rare parasitic soul worms. However, for Dean, this thing made him a little confused. If he wanted to hatch it, he needed to choose a suitable new host and raise it carefully. It would take at least a few months for the parasite egg to hatch in the new host, during which he must take good care of it. This kind of thing was not a problem for a big family like the dragon family. They had a lot of manpower and could assign special personnel to take care of it, but Dean could only fight alone. If he let Sergei take care of it, it was tantamount to seducing people to commit a crime. After all, it was the legendary parasitic soul worm. Once the other side was tempted, they would not only take the parasite away, but also take the initiative to frame him for fear of revenge. After experiencing so many things, Dean had a deeper understanding of people's hearts. The so-called loyalty was just a process of fighting with desire. Once the fight failed, it was betrayal. Legendary parasitic soul worm. I don't know if it is too extravagant to use it as nourishment? Dean muttered to himself with a different kind of emotion. Perhaps because he was a deified legendary magic mark, he didn't look at the legendary magic mark as excited and envious as before. But he knew that if this thing was left in the giant wall, it would most likely cause countless high-level people to fight for it. If it was used as nourishment for the magic mark, it would be a reckless waste of natural resources. It was equivalent to using gold to cast bricks to build a house. He struggled for a while, but finally shook his head and resisted the temptation in his heart. Although he could bring it back to the giant wall to sell or keep it for his trusted confidants to maximize the value of this thing in the future, but right now, survival was a problem, and he might die in the next moment. It was too far away to think about it. After making up his mind, Dean no longer thought about it. He sealed the parasite egg in a bottle and prepared to find a safe place to absorb it. After doing this, he looked around and gave up the idea of looking for another shadow hunter that might be alive. He walked to an egg, picked it up, and sent it to the cave above. After putting it down, he returned to the nest and immediately saw that there was an oval-shaped pit under the eggs that had been moved away. Dean frowned and glanced at the nest. A total of 37 eggs. After counting the number of eggs, he pondered. It was impossible to report all of these shadow hunter eggs to the Dragon Clan. After all, they were the eggs of legendary monsters. Although it was a problem whether they could hatch out of the nest environment, if they were lucky enough to hatch one or two, it was equivalent to having one or two legendary magic marks. Such a temptation was worth the risk. It doesn't matter if I hide it or not, the Dragon Clan will suspect me. If I don't hide it, they will think that I am hiding it. Dean said to himself, in other words, it doesn't matter if I hide or not. The important thing is not to touch their bottom line. Thinking of this, he suddenly had an estimate. He bent down and continued to pick up the eggs, sending them to the cave above. After carrying 8 eggs in a row, Dean stopped and returned to the nest. He smoothed the egg pit on the ground and smeared the sticky liquid on the ground on top of the egg pit, making it look the same as the surroundings. After disguising the scene, Dean glanced at the corpse of the shadow hunter. After thinking for a moment, he didn't take it away. If he left it here, it might give the Dragon Clan a feeling that there was a fight here. In that case, even if they noticed that the eggs might be missing, he would have one more reason to clear his name. Whoosh! He flew up the hole and came to the cave outside. Looking at the 8 white eggs on the ground, he clamped them under his armpit. Carrying 4 at the same time was already his limit, so he could only carry them twice. I have to find a secret place to hide them. I don't know when these things will hatch. If they hatch when I leave, my efforts will be in vain. Dean frowned slightly. This was very possible. Even if he immediately returned to the Dragon Clan and reported this matter, it would take 2 months before he could come to the wasteland for the second mission. If the second mission was in another wasteland, he could only find an opportunity to sneak here. Thinking of these problems, he felt it was a bit tricky. After thinking for a moment, he finally decided to find a more secure place to hide these eggs, separately. He only hoped that after these shadow hunters hatched individually, their growth speed wouldn't be that fast. Whoosh! He flew out of the cave with 4 eggs. When he passed through the cave entrance, he saw Martin's corpse. His heart suddenly moved, and he immediately changed direction, flying toward the previous escape route. After a while, he came to the place where Ruby died and rummaged around in the weed. Soon, he found Ruby's backpack under the cover of a few fallen leaves. He immediately opened it and saw that in addition to some mountaineering tools, there were several bottles and jars. Some were healing powders that could stop bleeding in time, and some were medicinal powders that could inhibit the spread of toxins. In addition, 3 of the bottles had 3 strange-looking worms. When the backpack was opened, the 3 worms in the bottles were stimulated by the light and slowly twisted. Dean was relieved when he finally found them. These 3 parasitic soul worms were corpse pecker, blood sender, and wind listener's parasitic soul worms. Wind listener's parasitic soul worm is this time's mission item. I'll keep it for the time being. The other 2 can be eaten, Dean thought in his heart. He took out the bottles of the 3 parasitic soul worms and put them in his backpack, along with the rest of the medicinal powders. Then he picked up 4 white eggs and flew high into the sky, looking for a suitable place to hide the shadow hunter's eggs. After flying at high altitude for about half an hour, Dean had almost explored more than half of the ruined city, but he still didn't find the desired hiding place. The city was too dilapidated. Although the basement under the building was hidden, the dragon guards who came out to perform missions liked to choose such a basement to live at night to avoid monsters. Moreover, the concrete above the basement was already on the verge of collapse and couldn't lock the hatched shadow hunter's eggs. Dean frowned and searched around. Suddenly, at the end of his field of vision, he saw a figure staggering on a desolate and broken street. It was Aisha, who had just left not long ago. At this moment, her hair was a bit messy, and her exquisite armor was stained with a lot of dust and blood. It was somewhat damaged. Judging from her walking posture, it seemed that she was seriously injured and couldn't even walk normally. Chapter 550. Is she injured? Dean was shocked. Without any hesitation, he swooped down from the sky with 4 eggs and went straight to Aisha. Aisha gasped softly, holding the wall and walking along the street. She just wanted to leave as soon as possible and find a suitable place to hide. However, with every step she took, she felt a lot of physical strength was lost. Her whole body was so weak that it was difficult for her to breathe. There seemed to be a thought in her heart that kept persuading herself to lie down and rest like this. It would be much more comfortable that way. But she knew that if she fainted here, she would most likely become the food of passing monsters or undead. Whoosh! Suddenly, she heard the sound of the wind breaking above her head. She could not help but look up and suddenly saw a black shadow approaching rapidly. She was shocked. Just as she was about to fight, she suddenly saw the face of the black shadow. It was Dean. She was stunned. The next moment, Dean fell from the sky and landed in front of her. He took a few steps closer and said, "Are you okay?" Aisha saw Dean was full of concern. She was relieved and said weakly, "I'm fine." Dean looked at her weak voice and was secretly surprised. He did not expect that with her strength, she would be in such a situation in the Orange Wasteland. He could not help but ask, "Have you found the legendary hunter?" "Yes." Aisha nodded gently and walked forward while holding the wall. Dean could not help but look up at the direction she came from. His face changed slightly. He did not expect the legendary hunter to be so strong that it was difficult for Aisha to resist. He could not help but ask, "Will it chase after us?" "No." Aisha reluctantly shook her head and said weakly, "It is dead." "Dead?" Dean was stunned. He stared at her and said, "You killed it?" Aisha whispered softly. Her feet suddenly became weak. Her body shook slightly and she almost fell down. Dean looked at her clenching her teeth and quickly said, "You are so badly injured. Is there anything I can help you with?" "No need." Aisha shook her head slightly and took a deep breath. She slowly withdrew her hand from the wall and walked forward step by step. She seemed to have recovered a little, but her footsteps were extremely heavy. Her calves trembled slightly as if she was trying to maintain balance. Dean didn't expect her to be so stubborn, but then he thought that maybe she did this because she didn't want to expose her weak side in front of him. Although they were acquaintances, but after all, they had been in contact with each other since childhood. Later they met twice, but the communication was not deep, so they were not very familiar with each other. At this moment, when she was at her weakest, even walking was difficult. She had no defense ability, so it was inevitable that she was vigilant. Thinking of this, he sighed inwardly. He pushed off the ground and flew away. There was a trace of loss in Aisha's eyes as she saw Dean fly away, but it quickly disappeared. She gritted her teeth and continued to move forward while holding the wall. Whoosh! Suddenly, another gust of wind descended. Aisha was startled. She looked up and saw Dean appear in front of her again. "I'll take you to a hidden place to let you heal." Without saying a word, Dean grabbed her wrist with one hand and held her body in his arms. His wings flapped and his body soared into the sky, flying into the distance. Before leaving, he glanced at the street and remembered it. The 4 eggs he had taken out were hidden in a building on this street. He would come back to get them after Aisha was settled. Aisha was shocked when Dean held her wrist. Since she became a saint, she had never been touched so intimately by others, let alone by a man who had no blood relationship with her. She wanted to resist, but found that she couldn't lift the slightest strength. The next moment, she was carried by Dean and flew into the sky. She looked up at Dean. Seeing that he had no malice, she was a little relieved. She felt tired, and her vision was a little blurred. She saw that the gray radiation clouds seemed to be very close to her. Suddenly, an idea came to her mind. Will the clouds in heaven be black? Whoosh! Dean flew over more than a dozen streets and glided down from the sky. He stopped in front of a subway station. He saw that the road above the subway station had completely collapsed, exposing the subway platform inside. 2 subways were stopped on several tracks. One of them was submerged by the collapsed road, and the other subway was like a black snake dormant in the darkness, covered with moss and rust. On the ground outside the subway station, there were many bones, most of which were human skeletons. Dean looked at it. It was not difficult to imagine what kind of tragic massacre had happened here before the disaster. He jumped down from a broken subway window with Aisha in his arms. He saw that on the seats on both sides of the subway there were skeletons and rotten corpses. Some of the corpses had light signs of decay. They were lying quietly with stone-gray skin, which was completely different from the surrounding skeletons. Obviously, these corpses were sleeping undead. Dean's entry immediately alarmed these undead. They opened their mouths slightly, and their bodies slowly recovered and sat up. Dean didn't pay attention to them. He turned around and kicked a skeleton on the subway seat next to him to the ground. It fell to the ground and broke into pieces. He gently put Aisha on the chair and sat down. At this time, the undeads had completely woken up. They sat up straight from the seat like evil spirits. Their eyes flashed with green light. They looked at Dean, who had his back to them. They stood up silently, raised their sharp claws, and rushed toward Dean. "Borrow it." Dean saw the dagger on Aisha's leg and said. He didn't wait for her to answer and quickly pulled it out. His body suddenly turned, and then he returned to the appearance of facing Aisha. He inserted the dagger back into her leg. "Okay." As soon as the words fell, several bangs sounded. Several heads of the undeads that rushed to Dean from behind slid down from their necks and fell to the ground. Their bodies were out of balance and fell straight down. The blood in the wound seemed to have frozen and did not sputter out. Aisha looked up at Dean. Her lips moved slightly and she whispered, "Thank you." Dean smiled. "You have saved me so many times. Always give me a chance to repay you." "It's just a little effort for me to save you," Aisha said weakly. She felt that her vision was getting more and more blurred. She knew that she couldn't hold on for a long time. She said weakly, "I'm going to sleep. Help me guard. Don't let anyone know my whereabouts." You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.